The gaslight does not flicker by accident. It dims because something has passed through the hall, something the house remembers. Velvet curtains hold their breath. Floorboards know footsteps that never appear in daylight. And behind walls measured to the inch, rooms exist that were never meant to be named. Victorian mansions were not built for honesty. They were engineered for concealment, for silence, for lives lived in parallel, one displayed to guests beneath chandeliers, another conducted through narrow passages where servants vanished, lovers hid, and disgrace was redirected rather than confronted. A door that locks from the outside, a staircase that ends in shadow, a bedroom where a marriage ends politely, and another begins in secret. If you enjoy slow, unsettling history like this, take a moment to subscribe and stay with me, and tell me, where are you listening from tonight? These houses stretched across continents, but their secrets traveled everywhere. Because once the visitors left and the lamps were lowered, these mansions became something else entirely. A place where affairs were timed to the ringing of bells, where scandals were sealed behind plaster, where entire lives were erased with a locked door and a good reputation upstairs. Tonight, we walk past the public rooms, into the spaces that were never shown, hidden rooms, forbidden affairs, and the dark secrets Victorian mansions were built to keep. A Victorian mansion never announces its true purpose. It presents itself calmly, almost kindly, with balanced windows and a front door centered just enough to reassure the eye. Brick is smoothed, stone is dressed, iron railings curve with restraint. Nothing appears accidental, nothing invites suspicion. The house seems to say it was built to shelter a family, to host dinners, to warm itself politely against the cold. And yet, from the moment it is finished, it begins learning how to conceal. These houses were raised during an age that feared exposure more than guilt. Reputation was not a reflection of behavior, it was a surface to be maintained. Architecture became one of its most reliable allies. Every measurement, every turn of a staircase, every door placed slightly off-center served a social purpose as much as a practical one. A mansion was not simply a residence. It was a statement, a performance, and when necessary, a defense. To stand in the entrance hall of such a house is to enter a carefully arranged lie. The ceiling lifts the gaze upward, encouraging awe rather than scrutiny. The floor gleams, polished often enough to erase the trace of countless feet that pass through it daily. Visitors are guided forward without realizing they are being guided at all. Sightlines are deliberate. What you are meant to see is open and generous. What you are not meant to notice is tucked just beyond the edge of comfort, behind a panel, beneath a stair, beyond a door that blends too well into the wall. Victorian designers understood how people moved when they believed they were unobserved. They also understood how people behaved when they thought they were. A mansion's layout reflects this dual awareness. Public rooms face the street, announcing civility and order. Private spaces retreat inward, layered behind one another like folded fabric. Between these worlds run thin channels of access, corridors narrow enough to discourage loitering, staircases angled to avoid eye contact, doors placed where only those instructed would ever think to use them. The lie is not only spatial, it is moral. A house like this suggests permanence, stability, lineage. It implies marriages that function, children raised properly, finances managed with dignity. Yet the walls are built thick not merely for warmth, but for discretion. Conversations are softened before they travel. Arguments are absorbed. Regret is kept from echoing. The house does not judge. It accommodates. Over time, it becomes complicit. Servants learn this quickly. They are trained not just in labor, but in navigation, how to cross a room without being remembered, how to pause until a bell rings, how to stand still enough to become part of the furnishing. The house assists them. It provides routes that avoid attention and spaces where waiting does not feel like trespass. These features are not indulgences. They are necessities. The lie depends on smooth operation. So do the inhabitants. Bedrooms are placed with intention. Some are close, some curiously distant. Doors close softly, locks turn without resistance. A visitor might assume comfort or fashion explains these choices. In truth, they explain behavior. They allow certain habits to persist without confrontation. They allow affection to be redirected, resentment to be managed, and inconvenient truths to be postponed indefinitely. The longer a mansion stands, the better it becomes at this work. Generations pass through it, each leaving behind objects, letters, alterations to walls that were once solid. A cupboard deepens. A passage is narrowed. A room changes its name. What began as design evolves into memory. The house does not forget what it was asked to hide. From the outside, it remains impressive. From the inside, it grows skilled. By the time history takes an interest, the house has already learned how to protect itself and those who depended on its discretion. This is where our story begins, not with scandal, but with structure. Not with betrayal, but with a building that understood, from its first stone, that truth was rarely welcome, and that a well-made lie could last for decades. The first light a Victorian mansion offers is never honest. It does not blaze or reveal. It softens. Gaslight pools rather than shines, gathering in corners and along cornices, leaving the center of rooms comfortably dim. Faces appear smoother beneath it. Objects lose their sharpness. Time itself seems to slow, as if the house prefers that nothing be examined too closely upon arrival. This was not coincidence. Gaslight was embraced not only for convenience, but for what it concealed. Unlike daylight, which enters without permission and exposes every surface equally, gaslight was controlled. It could be raised or lowered, directed or withdrawn. It allowed a household to decide how much of itself would be seen, and in mansions built for appearances, that control mattered. Visitors arriving at dusk were met with a deliberate choreography. The lamps were lit just early enough to suggest warmth, just low enough to discourage inspection. Shadows stretched gracefully along walls, hung with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow but never accuse. Mirrors reflected movement rather than detail. Even the air felt altered, heavy with coal residue and faintly sweet, encouraging slower breaths and quieter speech. First impressions were formed in this haze. The house wanted to be experienced emotionally before it was understood structurally. Guests were meant to feel welcomed, impressed, reassured. Their senses were guided gently away from questions. A missing sound became atmosphere. A closed door became privacy rather than exclusion. A faint draft from beneath a skirting board became character, not access. Gaslight also disguised labor. Servants passed through rooms carrying trays and messages, their movements softened by low illumination. Their presence registered only as function, not as personhood. In brighter light, they might have been noticed lingering, listening, watching. In gaslight, they became part of the mechanism, necessary, efficient, and forgettable. The house depended on this invisibility. For the family, gaslight served another purpose. It blurred the line between public composure and private fatigue. Faces could remain pleasant longer when imperfections were obscured. A trembling hand went unnoticed if it hovered just beyond the brightest circle. Emotional strain dissolved into shadow. What might have seemed alarming in daylight became merely tired in the evening glow. Rooms themselves changed character under gaslight. Corridors lengthened, staircases grew more imposing, doorways receded. A person unfamiliar with the house could be gently disoriented, guided by instinct rather than reason. This was useful. A guest who followed light rarely noticed where it led them or what lay just beyond it. Gaslight also encouraged silence. Sound behaved differently at night. Voices dropped, footsteps softened. The house seemed to lean inward, absorbing noise rather than reflecting it. Conversations that might have carried in the afternoon now stayed confined to their rooms. This made discretion easier. It also made eavesdropping more tempting. Walls listened while occupants believed themselves unobserved. Even moral boundaries softened beneath this light. Actions that would have felt improper by day became plausible by evening. A visit lingered. A glance lasted longer than intended. A door closed without explanation. Gaslight did not create these impulses, but it made them easier to justify. It suggested privacy without truly providing it. Over time, the mansion learned how to use this rhythm. Daylight for presentation, night for management. Problems introduced in the evening could be addressed quietly before morning. Evidence could be rearranged. Words could be retracted. Apologies could be delivered before breakfast. By sunrise, the house returned to its daytime self, appearing unchanged. To step into a Victorian mansion at first light is to encounter a carefully moderated reality. You are shown what the household wishes you to believe about itself. Stability, decorum, comfort. The gaslight has already done its work, preparing you to accept the illusion. Because once the lamps are raised and the doors are opened wide, the house has already decided what you will see and what you will never be invited to notice. No one admired the corridors of a Victorian mansion. They were not built to impress, nor to linger in. Their purpose was movement without presence, transition without acknowledgement. Long, narrow, and deliberately unremarkable, these passages were designed to vanish from memory the moment one left them. And yet, it was within these overlooked spaces that the true life of the house unfolded. Unlike the grand rooms arranged for display, corridors were stripped of personality. Walls were painted in subdued tones. Ornamentation was minimal or absent altogether. Light fell unevenly, often dimmer here than anywhere else. The effect was intentional. A corridor that invites attention fails its task. It must feel temporary, forgettable, barely real, so that those who pass through it are not fully seen, and those who observe do not think to remember. Victorian households depended on this invisibility. Servants crossed the house dozens of times each day, carrying messages, trays, laundry, news they were not meant to repeat. Corridors allowed this circulation to occur without interrupting the illusion of stillness upstairs. A drawing room might appear calm and unchanging for hours, while just beyond its walls, life moved constantly, efficiently, and unseen. These passages also enforced hierarchy. Their dimensions discouraged conversation. Two people could pass each other, but only just. Eye contact was brief. Speech felt intrusive. A corridor trained its occupants to keep moving, to keep quiet, to remain purposeful. To pause was to risk being noticed, and being noticed was rarely desirable. In many houses, corridors bent unexpectedly or narrowed without reason. This was not poor planning. It prevented sightlines from extending too far, ensuring that movement dissolved before it could be traced. A servant stepping out of one room would already be out of sight by the time a door opened elsewhere. Presence became fleeting. Accountability became optional. For family members, corridors served a different function. They allowed separation without explanation. One could leave a room without drawing attention, arrive somewhere else without being observed, retreat without appearing to flee. Emotional distance was made architectural. Arguments could be avoided simply by moving. Intimacy could be postponed by retreating into the passage where words lost their urgency. At night, corridors took on another character entirely. Gaslight barely reached them. Shadows clung to their corners, and the sound of footsteps traveled farther than intended. A person walking alone might feel the house watching not with intent, but with awareness. These were the spaces where letters were carried discreetly, where glances were exchanged and unspoken understandings confirmed. The corridor did not judge, it simply allowed. Over time, corridors became repositories of habit. Servants learned which floorboard creaked, which turn concealed them best. Family members memorized routes that avoided unwanted encounters. The house adapted. A door might be kept closed permanently, forcing traffic another way. A piece of furniture might be placed just so, narrowing the passage further. Each adjustment reinforced the corridor's purpose, to erase movement as soon as it occurred. What makes these spaces unsettling in retrospect is how little record they left behind. Ledgers list rooms, not passages. Floor plans simplify them. Memoirs rarely mention them at all. Yet without corridors, the house could not function. Secrets could not travel. Labor could not circulate. Lives could not remain separate while appearing unified. To walk through a preserved Victorian mansion today is to sense these absences. The corridors are still there, but emptied of their former necessity. Without servants moving quietly through them, without letters passed hand to hand, they feel oddly exposed, too narrow, too dark, too intentional. What once disappeared now draws attention. These passages were never meant to be remembered. They existed to support a world that demanded smooth surfaces and uninterrupted appearances. And in doing so, they became the quiet arteries of deception, carrying everything the house refused to show, and ensuring that nothing lingered long enough to be questioned. Every Victorian mansion declared its intentions through labels: drawing room, morning room, library, dining room. Each name suggested order, function, propriety. Each implied that life unfolded according to schedule and custom, that behavior followed architecture as obediently as furniture followed walls. But these titles were less descriptions than assurances designed to calm the visitor into believing that everything inside the house had a rightful place. Official rooms were stages. They existed to be entered, occupied briefly, and exited without complication. Their proportions were generous, their decor carefully curated. Nothing within them was accidental, yet nothing was meant to provoke curiosity. Chairs were arranged to encourage polite distance. Tables were placed to control posture and gesture. Even artwork served a social function, offering safe topics of conversation rather than personal revelation. The drawing room, in particular, was a masterpiece of restraint. It was neither fully public nor truly private, occupying a careful middle ground. Guests were welcomed here, but not trusted. Conversations unfolded within invisible boundaries. Laughter was permitted, but not volume. Emotion could be suggested, but never indulged. The room absorbed personality, smoothing it into something acceptable before releasing it back into the house. Dining rooms performed a similar task, though with greater ceremony. Meals followed strict progression. Seating was deliberate. The head of the table was more than a place. It was authority made visible. Under gaslight, faces appeared attentive, composed, united. Disagreements dissolved into the ritual of service. Courses arrived and departed like acts in a play, leaving little room for interruption. Libraries, despite their apparent intimacy, were often the most guarded spaces of all. Books suggested intellect, seriousness, moral weight. Yet many were chosen for appearance rather than use. Shelves were arranged to impress rather than invite inquiry. The room implied reflection, but discouraged vulnerability. To read was respectable. To reveal oneself was not. What united these rooms was not their function, but their limitation. They allowed only certain kinds of behavior, certain tones of voice, certain truths. Anything else had to be redirected elsewhere. Tears did not belong here. Confessions were unwelcome. Desire, anger, despair, these were emotions without an official room, and so they were displaced. Behind every official space existed another that absorbed what could not be shown. A narrow sitting room used when company was absent. A bedroom repurposed into refuge. A passageway where a conversation could finish without witnesses. The house did not deny human complexity. It simply refused to display it. Over time, occupants learned to perform within these rooms instinctively. A woman might speak one way in the drawing room and another entirely once the door closed. A man might adopt authority at the table, then relinquish it in a study meant only for himself. Children learned early, which rooms required stillness, and which allowed breath. The house trained its inhabitants as much as they maintained it. Yet the most important function of official rooms was reassurance. To outsiders, they suggested harmony. To insiders, they provided structure. No matter what tensions simmered elsewhere, these spaces remained unchanged. Their consistency allowed families to believe that disorder was temporary, manageable, containable. But the longer this performance continued, the more exhausting it became. Official rooms demanded constant upkeep, not just physical, but emotional. Smiles had to be rehearsed, topics selected carefully, silence used strategically. The house rewarded those who could maintain the illusion, and quietly marginalized those who could not. In this way, rooms with official purposes became both refuge and trap. They protected reputation while denying authenticity. They offered safety from exposure, but only at the cost of honesty. And while they appeared to anchor the household in respectability, they also pushed everything unresolved deeper into the house, into spaces without names, without rules, without witnesses. What was meant to organize life instead fragmented it. And as the mansion aged, these rooms remained pristine, while the unseen spaces behind them grew heavier with what they were never meant to contain. Upstairs was where the narrative changed, though few visitors were ever meant to notice. The ascent itself was deliberate. Staircases curved gently, slowing the body, tempering the breath. Carpets softened footsteps, muting arrival. By the time one reached the upper floor, the house had already instructed its guests to lower their voices, to narrow their expectations, to accept that what lay above was private and therefore unquestionable. Officially, upstairs was domestic. Bedrooms, dressing rooms, nurseries, spaces of rest, intimacy, and family life. This was the story the house told plainly. It suggested vulnerability, closeness, and care. Yet the upstairs of a Victorian mansion was rarely simple. It was layered, divided not only by walls but by permission. Not every door was meant to open. Not every stair was meant to be used. The primary staircase delivered visitors only so far. Beyond a certain point, circulation splintered. Narrower stairways branched away, steeper and less forgiving, reserved for those who worked rather than belonged. Servants learned quickly which routes were acceptable and which were forbidden. Family members learned just as quickly which parts of the house were theirs by right and which were not to be questioned. Bedrooms, in theory, were the most personal of spaces. In practice, they were often the most controlled. Their placement within the house reflected relationships that were not discussed aloud. Some were positioned close together, others separated by entire wings. Adjoining doors existed not for convenience, but for negotiation, opened when discretion allowed, closed when appearances required distance. A locked door upstairs rarely invited inquiry. Privacy, after all, was considered a virtue. Nurseries told another version of the story. Children were present in the household, but carefully contained. Raised above the main floors, they were kept close enough to be supervised, far enough to be unheard. Noise was managed. Emotion was regulated. Childhood was allowed, but only within boundaries. What occurred in these rooms shaped lives, yet rarely left a trace beyond the upper floor. The upstairs also absorbed what the official rooms rejected. Illness lingered here. Exhaustion rested here. Emotional collapse retreated upward, out of sight. A person who could not maintain composure downstairs was sent upstairs not as punishment, but as preservation. The house protected itself by isolating instability, where it would not disrupt the larger performance. At night, the upper floors became something else entirely. Gaslight dimmed further here, and some rooms remained unlit altogether. Footsteps sounded closer. Walls seemed thinner. A whisper could travel farther than intended. It was in these hours that truths emerged not loudly but persistently. Conversations took place in half-lit bedrooms, decisions made behind closed doors that would shape the household by morning. Servants moved carefully upstairs at night, aware that the rules shifted with the hour. What was forbidden by day might be tolerated by evening. What was unseen by daylight might be expected after dark. The house allowed this ambiguity. It did not clarify. It accommodated. Over time, upstairs developed its own internal logic. Those who lived within it understood where to stand, when to speak, when to withdraw. The house trained them gently, relentlessly. A creaking step became a warning. A draft beneath a door signaled presence. Nothing needed to be explained. Everything was understood. From below, upstairs appeared calm. Curtains drawn, lights extinguished, order restored. Visitors departed, believing the household settled for the night. In truth, the most consequential moments often unfolded after the lamps were lowered, decisions made quietly, relationships renegotiated, futures altered without witnesses. The upstairs story was never meant to be told in full. It existed to hold complexity away from public view, to preserve the illusion that life downstairs was complete, stable, and sufficient. But the house knew better. It always did. Above the polished rooms and practiced conversations, the mansion stored its contradictions. And as long as the stairs remained narrow and the doors remained closed, the lie could continue contained neatly, one floor above the truth. At first glance, every door in a Victorian mansion appears accounted for. They align with walls, match the paneling, share the same handles and hinges as the rest. Nothing announces itself as unusual. And yet, with time, certain doors begin to feel wrong, not because they are ornate or hidden, but because they exist at all. These are the doors that do not correspond neatly to the rooms they supposedly serve. A narrow door at the end of a corridor that opens onto nothing a visitor remembers being shown. A panel that swings inward where no space seems possible. A door positioned just slightly too close to another, suggesting an interior arrangement that does not match the logic of the house as presented. They do not invite curiosity. They discourage it. Victorian builders were meticulous, but they were also pragmatic. Houses were not static structures. They evolved with the needs of the family. Walls were moved, rooms subdivided, passages added where silence was required. When circumstances changed, when a relative stayed longer than intended, when illness lingered, when discretion became necessary, architecture adapted quietly. Doors were added not to welcome, but to manage. Some of these doors led to service areas never meant for guests. Others connected rooms that should have remained separate according to social expectation. A discreet passage between two bedrooms. A concealed entry into a dressing room. A shortcut allowing someone to move unseen from one wing to another. Each door solved a problem without naming it. The important detail was not what lay behind these doors, but how easily they could be ignored. Their surfaces were designed to blend. Handles were plain. Frames unremarkable. In some cases, the door itself was disguised as wall paneling, visible only to those who already knew where to look. This was not secrecy born of fear, but of habit. The household understood what the door was for, and therefore felt no need to acknowledge it. Over time, these doors accumulated meaning. To some, they represented convenience. To others, relief. To a few, dread. A door used only at certain hours carried the weight of anticipation. A door locked from one side signaled authority. Another, rarely opened, became symbolic. A boundary no one crossed without consequence. Servants were often the first to recognize the true purpose of these doors. They learned which were to be used without question and which required permission. A door that should not be there often came with rules that were never spoken aloud. Do not open it during daylight. Do not use it if guests are present. Do not mention it unless asked. The house enforced these rules through routine rather than threat. For family members, such doors allowed lives to be compartmentalized. A person could be one version of themselves on one side and another entirely on the other. A conversation could end with the closing of a door and resume later without acknowledgement. Mistakes could be contained. Relationships could be negotiated privately. The door absorbed the tension that passed through it. What unsettles modern observers is not the existence of these doors, but their subtlety. They do not resemble the secret panels of fiction. They are ordinary, respectable, plausible. Their presence suggests that concealment was not an exception, but an expectation, that the house assumed certain truths would require containment. When families moved out and estates changed hands, these doors often remained. New occupants sensed them without understanding them. A draft where none should be, a wall that sounded hollow, a locked door with no obvious key. Over time, some were sealed permanently, their purpose forgotten, but their unease preserved. These doors should not be there according to the story the house tells visitors, but according to the life the house actually supported. They were essential. They allowed discretion to function without explanation. They enabled silence to replace confrontation. And once a house has learned where to place such doors, it never forgets. Even when their hinges rust and their frames warp, the spaces they once guarded remain quiet, unused, and waiting proof that the mansion was always prepared to hide what could not be faced. Silence in a Victorian mansion was never accidental. It was cultivated, engineered, and maintained with the same care given to ornament and symmetry. From the thickness of the walls to the placement of carpets, from the angle of staircases to the depth of door frames, the house was taught how to absorb sound. Noise was treated as a threat not merely to comfort, but to order. Victorian society feared what sound implied. Raised voices suggested loss of control. Laughter carried too far hinted at impropriety. Crying was a failure of restraint. Silence, by contrast, signaled discipline. A quiet house appeared respectable, composed, morally sound. And so silence became an architectural goal, not just a behavioral expectation. Walls were built thick, often doubled, not only for warmth but for discretion. Doors closed with a softened finality, padded by layers of wood and fabric. Heavy drapes muffled echoes. Even furniture contributed: upholstered chairs, thick tablecloths, rugs layered upon rugs. The result was a house that swallowed noise before it could travel, leaving conversations isolated within their rooms. This design allowed multiple lives to unfold simultaneously without collision. A heated exchange could take place behind one door, while polite conversation continued undisturbed nearby. Illness could progress quietly upstairs while dinner was served below without interruption. Silence allowed contradiction to coexist without acknowledgement. Servants were trained to respect this principle above all else. Footsteps were softened, objects were set down gently, voices lowered instinctively. To make noise unnecessarily was to draw attention, and attention was dangerous. Silence preserved employment. It also preserved secrets. Even communication systems were designed with quiet in mind. Bells rang softly, signaling rather than announcing. Servants appeared without explanation and departed without sound. The house seemed to anticipate needs before they were voiced, reducing the necessity of speech altogether. The less said, the better. For family members, silence offered refuge and control. A closed door did not demand explanation. Absence could be interpreted generously. Emotions could be managed privately, their evidence absorbed by the house before it reached others. Silence became a form of negotiation. What was not spoken could not be challenged. Yet this quiet carried weight. Over time, silence accumulated. Words left unsaid did not disappear. They lingered, pressing against walls that refused to transmit them. Tension settled into rooms like dust, invisible but persistent. A house built to suppress sound eventually began to feel heavy with it. At night, this silence deepened. Without the movement of servants or the rhythm of daily routines, the house listened to itself. Every creak felt amplified, every distant sound ambiguous. Silence no longer felt reassuring. It felt watchful. In these hours, occupants became acutely aware of what the house concealed and of how much depended on its continued discretion. Children sensed this early. They learned when to speak and when not to ask. They learned that certain topics dissolved into quiet rather than answers. The house educated them gently, relentlessly, shaping their understanding of what could be expressed and what must remain internal. Modern visitors often describe preserved Victorian mansions as peaceful. They note the calm, the stillness, the absence of noise. What they are sensing is not tranquility, but discipline. The residue of a design that prioritized suppression over expression, containment over resolution. Silence was never neutral here. It was a tool, wielded carefully to maintain appearances and prevent rupture. It allowed lives to continue without confrontation, but it also ensured that nothing was ever truly addressed. In a house like this, silence was not the absence of sound. It was presence, intentional, pervasive, and deeply instructive. And once built into the walls, it remained long after the voices that feared it had gone quiet themselves. Respectability was not an attitude in a Victorian mansion. It was a structure. Long before furniture was chosen or portraits were hung, the house was drawn to embody a moral position. Walls were placed where behavior needed containment. Sightlines were calculated to discourage familiarity. Entrances were aligned to present balance, order, and authority before a single word was spoken. The blueprint itself assumed scrutiny and prepared for it. Victorian respectability was never passive. It demanded constant reinforcement. A mansion had to look correct at all times, regardless of what occurred inside it. Architecture became the first line of defense. From the street, the house presented symmetry and permanence. Nothing protruded, nothing leaned. The facade suggested stability so convincingly that observers rarely imagined instability could exist behind it. Inside, this principle continued with ruthless precision. Rooms were arranged not for comfort, but for compliance. Public spaces occupied the most visible positions, ensuring that guests encountered order before intimacy. Private areas retreated inward, layered behind thresholds that required invitation or authority to cross. The deeper one moved into the house, the more permission was required, not explicitly, but intuitively. Respectability dictated circulation. Certain paths were encouraged, others quietly discouraged. A guest never wandered accidentally into a family bedroom. A servant never crossed a drawing room unless summoned. These rules were not posted, they were absorbed. The house taught them through discomfort, through narrow doorways, sudden turns, changes in light that signaled where one did and did not belong. Even decorations served this blueprint. Colors were chosen for restraint, patterns repeated predictably, ornamentation stopped short of indulgence. The aim was reassurance, not delight. A respectable house avoided extremes, because extremes invited questions. Nothing should appear excessive enough to suggest desperation, nor sparse enough to imply neglect. This architectural morality extended to behavior. A person who lingered too long in the wrong room felt immediately out of place. The house corrected them without confrontation. Furniture placement guided posture. Ceiling height influenced tone. Windows framed views that encouraged contemplation rather than escape. The environment shaped conduct gently, persistently. Bedrooms reflected this moral geometry most clearly. Marital rooms were positioned to signal legitimacy. Children's rooms were placed for supervision, not comfort. Spare rooms existed not for hospitality, but contingency for illness, disgrace, or removal. Every space anticipated a possible failure of decorum and prepared a place to contain it. What made this blueprint effective was its invisibility. Respectability appeared natural, inevitable. Guests assumed the household functioned smoothly because the house looked composed. Family members believed restraint was their own virtue, unaware how thoroughly the environment enforced it. Architecture took credit for nothing. while shaping everything. Yet this design came at a cost. A house built entirely around appearances left little room for honesty. Emotional overflow had nowhere to go but inward. Conflict could be delayed, not resolved. Grief could be hidden, not shared. Over time, the house accumulated these pressures, holding them within walls that refused to acknowledge their existence. Respectability also required surveillance, not formal but ambient. Windows overlooked entrances. Hallways funneled movement. Sound traveled selectively. The house allowed occupants to sense when they were being observed without ever confirming it. This uncertainty kept behavior within acceptable limits more effectively than any rule. As years passed, the blueprint hardened. Alterations were made cautiously, always preserving the moral logic of the original design. Even renovations respected the hierarchy of visibility and concealment. New rooms adopted old rules. The house evolved, but never contradicted itself. What remains today is the shell of this ethic. Visitors admire the craftsmanship, the balance, the dignity. They sense discipline without understanding its source. What they are encountering is a building designed to perform virtue, one that learned, early on, that appearances must be protected at all costs. Respectability was never simply lived inside these houses. It was drafted, measured, and built into them room by room, wall by wall, until it became indistinguishable from the structure itself. A Victorian mansion does not forget. It cannot speak, cannot accuse, cannot correct the record, but it remembers. Long after names are removed from doorplates and portraits are taken down, the house retains the shape of what occurred within it, not as narrative, but as residue. A pause where a corridor narrows, a room that feels heavier than its dimensions allow, a door that resists opening not through damage, but through habit. These houses outlived the people who depended on them. Generations passed through the same rooms, believing themselves original, unaware that the floor beneath their feet had already learned how to hold grief, restraint, and compromise. Each family assumed the house was neutral. In truth, it had been listening from the beginning. The mansion witnessed without judgment. It observed routine first meals repeated, voices modulated, doors opened and closed at predictable hours. Over time, it learned patterns. It understood which rooms hosted honesty and which demanded performance. It recognized which staircases were used in haste, which in avoidance. The house did not need explanation. It learned through repetition. When something went wrong, the house adjusted. A bedroom ceased to be used. A chair was moved permanently closer to the fire. A window remained closed even in summer. These changes were small, barely perceptible, but the house recorded them all. What the family chose not to acknowledge, the building absorbed. Scandals left the deepest impressions, not the public ones, which were managed quickly, but the private reckonings that followed. The night when voices were lowered too far. The morning when a servant avoided eye contact. The week when curtains stayed drawn without explanation. These moments altered the atmosphere of rooms long after the participants convinced themselves they had moved on. The house bore witness to illness quietly. Beds repositioned, bells rung more often, footsteps softened. Eventually, movement ceased altogether, yet the room did not return to neutrality. It remembered the waiting, the controlled despair, the careful maintenance of normalcy, while something irreversible unfolded upstairs. Even after furniture was replaced and walls repainted, the room retained its gravity. Children grew up within this watchful structure, sensing when something had happened without being told. They learned which rooms inspired unease, which corridors demanded silence. The house educated them without words, passing on emotional knowledge that families refused to articulate. In this way, the mansion became a secondary guardian, shaping behavior through memory rather than instruction. Servants understood this best. They were the constant presence across decades, the ones who noticed which rooms changed owners too often, which doors were locked longer than necessary. They carried this knowledge silently, aware that the house would outlast them as well. The mansion kept their secrets too, though history would not. What makes the house an effective witness is its patience. It does not require recognition. It does not demand resolution. It simply holds. A lie told once might be forgotten by those who told it, but the space in which it was told remains. The house remembers the conditions under which truth was avoided. When estates were sold, new owners often remarked on an indefinable atmosphere, a sense that certain rooms felt uneasy, despite no visible cause. They blamed age, drafts, poor maintenance. Rarely did they consider that the house was reacting to their presence not actively, but reflexively, drawing on memories of previous occupants who had behaved similarly, hoped similarly, concealed similarly. The mansion does not distinguish between virtue and failure. It records both with equal clarity. It remembers the discipline that preserved appearances and the damage that discipline caused. It does not weigh outcomes. It only retains the shape of events. In this way, the house becomes more than shelter. It becomes archive. Not a written one, but a physical accumulation of choices made quietly, compromises accepted without protest, lives shaped by what could not be spoken aloud. Long after the final family leaves and the last servant departs, the house remains still balanced, still respectable, still composed. And within its walls, everything it witnessed waits patiently, preserved not as history, but as atmosphere, ready to be felt by anyone who steps inside and listens closely enough. There is a precise moment each evening when a Victorian mansion changes character. It does not announce itself. Nothing dramatic occurs. A servant adjusts a valve, a flame lowers, light softens across ceilings and walls, and suddenly, the house is no longer performing for the outside world. It has turned inward. When the lamps go low, the architecture reveals its true intention. Shadows lengthen where they were once controlled. Corners deepen, doorways retreat. The house seems to exhale, relieved of the effort required to maintain clarity. What remains is atmosphere thick, muted, permissive. Daylight demanded order. Evening allowed management. In these hours, rooms loosened their grip on purpose. The drawing room ceased to be a stage and became a holding space. The dining room no longer enforced ceremony, only aftermath. Chairs were left where bodies had settled, rather than where propriety dictated. Silence expanded, no longer polite, but expectant. This was the time when boundaries softened without disappearing. A door left ajar meant something different at night. A footstep heard after hours carried weight. The house understood this shift and adjusted accordingly. Gaslight was never meant to illuminate fully. It was meant to obscure gently, to allow just enough visibility for navigation without inviting scrutiny. Servants moved differently now. Their work became quieter, more deliberate. Tasks were completed with minimal disturbance. They knew the house was listening not as authority, but as witness. Night required precision. A dropped object echoed longer. A misstep lingered in memory. The house did not forgive noise easily after dark. For family members, evening offered opportunity. Conversations postponed during the day resumed in lowered voices. Decisions avoided in daylight were finally addressed, though rarely resolved. A person could move from one room to another without explanation. Absence became less suspicious. Presence became negotiable. Bedrooms took on new importance, not as places of rest, but as zones of containment. Doors closed earlier, lamps were lowered further. The house encouraged retreat, not sleep, but separation. What could not be shared publicly could at least be isolated privately. It was also during these hours that the mansion absorbed its most enduring impressions. Fear lingered longer at night. Regret settled more deeply. Anticipation sharpened. The house learned these sensations and stored them carefully, adding them to the quiet accumulation that defined its inner life. Night allowed contradictions to coexist. A household could appear settled while remaining deeply fractured. Laughter from one room did not negate the silence in another. The house made space for both, holding them apart so they would not interfere. Visitors rarely saw this version of the mansion. Those who stayed overnight sensed it without understanding it. Sleep felt lighter, corridors felt longer. Sounds seemed intentional even when they were not. The house was no longer concerned with reassurance. It had shifted into maintenance mode. When dawn returned, the house reassembled itself. Lamps were raised, curtains drawn back, order restored. Whatever had been negotiated in the low light was folded neatly away, preserved but unspoken. The structure returned to its public posture, appearing unchanged. But the house remembered the night. It remembered which doors were opened after hours, which rooms were avoided, which silences were heavier than others. These memories informed future evenings, shaping how the house would respond again when the lamps were lowered. In this way, the true life of the Victorian mansion did not occur at noon, nor during social calls or formal meals. It unfolded quietly, consistently, in the dim hours when appearances were no longer required to perform, only to endure. When the lamps went low, the house did what it had always been built to do: contain, conceal, and carry forward everything that daylight refused to acknowledge. No guest ever admired the servants' staircase. It was not meant to be seen, let alone remembered. Narrow, steep, and tucked away behind doors that blended into paneling, it existed outside the story the house told about itself. And yet, without it, the entire performance would have collapsed. The servants' staircase was a vertical corridor of discipline. It did not curve gracefully or invite pause. Steps rose sharply, often uneven, demanding attention and humility from those who used them. Hands brushed close to walls, shoulders turned slightly inward. One ascended or descended with purpose, never leisure. The staircase taught the body how to move before the mind had time to question why. Its placement was deliberate, always close enough to serve the main rooms efficiently, yet far enough to avoid intrusion. From the drawing room, it might be only a few feet away, separated by a wall thin enough to carry sound but thick enough to deny presence. A tray could arrive as if summoned by thought alone. A servant could vanish the moment their task was complete. The staircase enabled this illusion. Servants learned its rhythms intimately: which steps creaked, which landings caught drafts, which hours allowed faster movement without risk of being overheard. The staircase became a map of survival, its angles memorized more carefully than any formal room upstairs. To misjudge it was to draw attention. To hesitate was to be seen. Unlike the grand staircase, which displayed status and lineage, the servants' staircase erased identity. Everyone who used it became function, rather than person. There were no portraits on its walls, no mirrors to reflect the face. Light was sparse, often borrowed from distant windows or single fixtures placed high and dim. The effect was intentional. One did not linger where one was not meant to exist. And yet, this staircase connected everything. Through it passed meals, letters, medicine, whispered instructions, and unspoken knowledge. It carried news faster than any formal announcement. A change in household mood was felt here, first reflected in the speed of footsteps, the frequency of trips, the weight of what was carried. Servants knew when something was wrong long before it reached the dining table. At night, the servant staircase became the most active artery of the house. While family members retreated behind closed doors, servants continued to move quietly, efficiently, invisibly. The staircase allowed care without presence. Illness could be tended, lamps adjusted, messages delivered, all without disturbing the illusion of stillness above. It also absorbed secrets, conversations overheard at landings, glances exchanged in passing, knowledge gathered without intention. Servants were never meant to speak of what they learned here, and most did not. Silence was not merely expected, it was enforced by necessity. Employment depended on discretion. Survival depended on forgetting. Yet the house remembered. The servant staircase bore witness to exhaustion that never reached the drawing room, to grief managed privately, to moments of quiet rebellion, a pause taken too long, a breath held at a landing, a decision not to hurry. These moments left no record except in the worn edges of steps and the polished rails smoothed by countless unseen hands. When families moved on and servants were replaced, the staircase remained unchanged. New occupants sensed it without understanding it. Its proportions felt uncomfortable. Its presence suggested movement where none was visible. In preserved houses, visitors often avoid it instinctively, as though aware it was never meant for them. The servant staircase represents the truth beneath the performance. That order required constant labor. That silence depended on movement. That respectability was upheld by those who were never acknowledged. It was not a secondary feature of the Victorian mansion. It was essential. Without it, the house could not function, could not conceal, could not endure. And though its users were meant to be forgotten, the staircase itself never forgot them. Each step holding the memory of lives spent moving quietly, so that others could believe nothing was moving at all. Behind the visible order of a Victorian mansion, there existed another house, entirely one compressed into the spaces no guest was meant to imagine. Between plaster and brick, beneath staircases and above ceilings, passageways threaded through the structure like an unacknowledged nervous system. They were not accidents, they were solutions. These passageways behind the walls were born of necessity rather than extravagance. As households grew more complex, as expectations of service increased and scrutiny intensified, movement had to be managed without interruption. The house could not afford to pause for labor. Meals had to appear without effort. Messages had to arrive without witnesses. People had to pass through rooms without being present in them. The walls obliged. Some passages were narrow corridors concealed behind paneling, their entrances disguised as cupboards or decorative seams. Others were voids widened just enough for a person to pass sideways, shoulders brushing wood lath and cold brick. They were seldom straight. A gentle bend prevented sound from traveling too far. A low beam discouraged haste. The body learned to move quietly or not at all. Those who used these spaces understood their rules instinctively. One did not speak inside the walls. One did not pause unless necessary. Breath was measured. Clothing was adjusted to avoid rustle. A dropped object could echo in ways that felt dangerously intimate. The passage demanded discipline and returned it in kind. For servants, these routes were lifelines. They allowed care to be delivered without intrusion and tasks to be completed without exposure. A maid could reach a bedchamber unseen. A valet could move from study to dressing room without crossing a public threshold. The house maintained its illusion of effortless order because labor flowed where eyes could not follow. But these passages did more than serve efficiency. They enabled discretion. A conversation could be overheard without eavesdropping. A letter could be delivered without record. A person could move from one wing to another without explanation. The house did not ask why, it simply provided the means. Over time, these spaces acquired an atmosphere of their own. The air was cooler, the smell different: dust, old wood, faint traces of polish and coal smoke trapped without circulation. Sound behaved strangely here, amplified in one direction, swallowed in another. The walls seemed to press closer, encouraging humility and restraint. Family members rarely entered these passages, but they were aware of them. Their existence was felt rather than seen, a sense that the house could observe without being observed. This knowledge shaped behavior. Doors closed carefully, voices lowered instinctively. The possibility of unseen movement enforced caution more effectively than any rule. At night, the passageways were most alive. When the public rooms fell silent and bedrooms closed, movement continued within the walls. Lamps were adjusted, medicine carried, messages passed. The house breathed quietly through its hidden arteries, sustaining itself while maintaining the appearance of rest. Not all passageways were used regularly. Some existed for contingencies, illness, scandal, prolonged absence. They remained untouched for years, their purpose dormant but intact. A sealed panel might hide a route that had not been needed since a particular crisis passed. The house kept it anyway. It had learned that discretion, once required, might be required again. As years passed and renovations occurred, some passages were narrowed or sealed, others were forgotten entirely. New occupants sensed them as drafts, hollow sounds, unexplained temperature changes. The house carried these absences like scars, reminders of functions no longer acknowledged but not entirely erased. What makes these passageways unsettling is their implication. They suggest that the house anticipated concealment as part of daily life. That privacy was not a personal right but an architectural feature. That movement, like truth, was safest when unobserved. These hidden routes allowed the mansion to operate as a single, seamless organism while appearing still. They ensured that what needed to happen could happen quietly, without challenging the narrative presented to the world. Behind the walls, life continued compressed, disciplined, unseen, and though the people who relied on these passages were meant to pass without trace, the house remembers every step, every pause, every careful breath taken in spaces that were never meant to be acknowledged. In a Victorian mansion, walls were never as solid as they appeared. They were thick, yes, layered with plaster, brick, timber, and fabric, but they were not mute. Sound traveled through them selectively, unpredictably, as if the house itself decided what should be overheard and what should be lost entirely. This was not a flaw, it was a feature. Listening walls were the unintended consequence of deliberate design. Rooms were arranged closely to preserve warmth and efficiency. Passageways ran alongside chambers meant for privacy. Servant routes threaded behind family rooms. These proximities allowed sound to seep where eyes could not. A voice raised just slightly, a sob restrained too late, a sentence spoken under the assumption of safety. The walls absorbed it all. Victorians understood this intuitively. They learned how to speak in their houses. Certain rooms encouraged openness, others demanded caution. A drawing room might feel secure because it was public, while a bedroom ironically felt exposed because of what surrounded it. The house taught its occupants which spaces carried sound and which swallowed it, though the lessons were never verbalized. Servants became fluent in this acoustics. They knew where to stand to hear without appearing to listen, where a wall thinned near a chimney or staircase, where a whispered argument would bleed into the corridor behind it. This knowledge was rarely abused openly. Silence remained the rule, but awareness shaped behavior. A servant who knew too much learned to know it quietly. Family members sensed the walls as well. A disagreement that might have erupted elsewhere softened here, reduced to controlled phrases and pauses. Confessions were carefully framed, names avoided. The possibility of being overheard, even if unconfirmed, kept emotion contained. The walls did not need to reveal what they carried. The fear that they might was enough. These listening walls reinforced the house's broader purpose: containment without confrontation. Secrets could be shared cautiously, knowing they might escape, but not knowing how far they would travel. Responsibility dissolved into uncertainty. If something was heard, it was rarely acknowledged. If something spread, it did so without origin. The house allowed knowledge to circulate without accountability. At night, this effect intensified. Sound carried differently after dark. The absence of movement made every whisper feel louder. A single footstep might echo through unseen channels, arriving distorted and directionless. Occupants lay awake, uncertain whether they were alone with their thoughts or accompanied by the house's quiet attention. The walls also preserved echoes long after voices faded. A room where arguments had been frequent never felt neutral again. Even silence there carried tension. New occupants sensed it immediately, though they could not explain why. The house had learned to hold sound and release it as atmosphere. In time, some families attempted to correct this. Walls were reinforced, drapes added, furniture rearranged. But these efforts only shifted the listening, never eliminated it. The house adapted, finding new paths for sound to travel. It had been built to observe, even when no one intended it to. What makes listening walls unsettling is not that they hear, but that they remember. A conversation forgotten by those who spoke it might linger as discomfort years later. A secret believed buried might resurface as rumor without source. The house does not repeat what it hears verbatim. It transforms it into presence. This is why Victorian mansions often feel watchful to modern visitors. Not haunted, but attentive, as though something is listening without needing to be understood. The walls have learned this behavior over decades of careful restraint and suppressed expression. In such a house, privacy was never absolute. It was negotiated constantly, shaped by architecture as much as intention. Words were chosen carefully, not only for their meaning, but for their potential travel. The walls listened, and because they did, everyone learned to speak as if they were already being overheard. In a Victorian mansion, visibility was never neutral. To be seen was to be accounted for, assessed, remembered. To remain unseen was not absence, but skill, a discipline learned through repetition and reinforced by architecture. The house rewarded those who mastered it. Not being seen did not mean hiding. It meant moving in ways that did not register, standing where eyes slid past rather than landed, entering rooms at moments when attention was already occupied, leaving before presence could be acknowledged. The house taught this art quietly, shaping behavior through discomfort and convenience rather than instruction. Servants learned it first. Their training emphasized timing as much as task. A maid entered a room when conversation peaked, when guests leaned toward one another, and vision narrowed. A footman stood still enough to become furniture, present yet unnoticed. A housekeeper appeared precisely when her authority would not disrupt the social order. The house made this possible through alcoves near doorways, through shadows cast at deliberate angles, through routes that delivered a person exactly where they were needed and nowhere else. The art extended beyond labor. Family members practiced it too, though less consciously. A daughter learned how to pass through a sitting room without inviting comment. A son learned which corridor allowed retreat without explanation. A wife learned when to remain upstairs, when to descend, when to linger at thresholds where presence could be claimed or denied depending on response. The house supported these choices, offering places to pause without being observed and paths that avoided scrutiny. Furniture played its part. High-backed chairs created visual barriers. Heavy tables anchored attention away from peripheries. Screens and plants softened sight lines, allowing someone to exist at the edge of a room without becoming its focus. Even mirrors were positioned to reflect space rather than people, expanding rooms while diminishing individuals. Timing mattered most. The house operated on rhythms, meals, calls, hours of rest predictable enough to exploit. To move between these rhythms was to pass unnoticed. A person who understood the house could navigate it almost invisibly, stepping into spaces during their least observed moments. The house did not resist this. It had been built to accommodate it. Not being seen was also a moral stance. Visibility implied accountability. Invisibility offered freedom without confrontation. A disagreement could be avoided by absence. An emotion could be managed privately if it never appeared publicly. The house encouraged this restraint, rewarding discretion with comfort and punishing exposure with unease. Children absorbed this lesson early. They learned which rooms tolerated noise and which demanded silence. They learned where to wait when adults needed privacy, how to listen without appearing to listen. The house educated them gently, using spatial cues rather than reprimand. A narrow doorway discouraged lingering. A sudden change in light signaled retreat. At night, the art intensified. Gaslight lowered the stakes of movement. Shadows widened. A person could cross a landing without being identified, pause near a door without raising suspicion. The house allowed this ambiguity, recognizing that after dark, visibility was less important than control. But invisibility carried its own cost. To master it was to accept erasure. Those who moved unseen were rarely acknowledged afterward. Their contributions dissolved into the house's functioning. Over time, this absence became habit, then identity. The house remembered their movement even as people forgot their names. When estates changed hands and routines broke, the absence of these skills became apparent. New occupants moved clumsily, announced themselves without meaning to, occupied rooms too fully. The house felt unsettled, as though its rules were being ignored. It had been designed for subtlety, not assertion. The art of not being seen was not deception, it was adaptation, a response to a world that demanded order without acknowledging the labor required to maintain it. The house offered the means, and those who lived within it learned quickly. In a Victorian mansion, invisibility was not a failure of presence, it was proof of understanding. And the house, ever attentive, made sure that those who learned this art could move freely, quietly, and without leaving a mark that anyone else would be willing to notice. Control in a Victorian mansion rarely announced itself. It did not shout or strike, it rang softly, turned quietly, and waited patiently to be obeyed. Keys and bells, small, ordinary objects, formed a network of authority so complete that it rarely needed enforcement. The house itself ensured compliance. Keys were everywhere, though never visible all at once. They hung at a housekeeper's waist, rested in drawers, lay hidden behind panels known only to a few. Each key represented access, carefully granted and easily withdrawn. A locked door did not require explanation. It simply existed, unquestioned. Those denied entry learned quickly not to ask why. The distribution of keys revealed the true hierarchy of the house. Servants held many, but rarely the ones that mattered most. Family members possessed fewer, yet controlled the spaces that defined legitimacy and privacy. Some rooms were accessible only by a single key, entrusted to one person alone. Illness, scandal, or prolonged absence often shifted this balance temporarily. But the principle remained intact. Access was power. Bells complemented this system perfectly. Unlike voices, bells carried authority without emotion. A bell did not ask, it summoned. Its tone varied by room, each sound distinct and instantly understood by those trained to respond. A bell could demand presence without granting conversation, service without recognition. The house spoke through these signals, directing movement while maintaining silence. The bell system also enforced distance. A family member need not cross a room or raise their voice. A servant need not explain their arrival. The interaction occurred through sound alone, preserving hierarchy and avoiding intimacy. Control remained impersonal, efficient, unquestioned. Over time, bells shaped behavior. Servants learned to anticipate them, responding before the sound was complete. Family members learned which bells to ring and which to avoid. Some bells summoned help, others signaled urgency. A few were reserved for moments that could not be managed quietly. The house remembered these distinctions long after the bells themselves fell silent. Keys and bells worked together to regulate the flow of life. A door locked from the outside combined with a bell rung from within created containment, disguised as care. A room could be sealed and serviced without its occupant ever stepping beyond its threshold. Privacy and isolation blurred seamlessly. This system extended beyond servants. Family members controlled one another through access as well. A door left unlocked invited approach. A door locked without explanation ended conversation. Bells replaced speech where words might complicate matters. Control passed quietly from hand to hand, rarely acknowledged, always effective. Children learned this language early. They understood which bells were forbidden, which doors required permission. They learned that silence was often safer than sound, that waiting was preferable to knocking. The house educated them not through discipline, but through structure. Disobedience met resistance not from people, but from the building itself. At night, keys and bells took on additional weight. A bell rung after hours suggested urgency or defiance. A door unlocked late carried implication. Servants moved with heightened awareness, knowing that nighttime disturbances rarely ended without consequence. The house listened carefully then, storing these moments alongside others it had been asked to contain. When households changed and servants departed, the absence of this system was felt immediately. New occupants struggled with the logic of access. Doors seemed excessive. Bells felt intrusive. The house appeared stubborn, resistant to casual use. It had been trained to respond to authority exercised quietly and consistently. Keys rusted. Bells fell silent. Yet the structure of control remained embedded in the house. Doors still closed where they always had. Corridors still funneled movement. Rooms still demanded permission, even without locks. In the Victorian mansion, control did not rely on force. It relied on cooperation engineered through design. Keys and bells provided the language. The house enforced the grammar, and everyone within it learned to listen, wait, and obey, often without realizing they had been trained to do so at all. Every Victorian mansion had spaces that never greeted the day. Tucked beneath staircases, pressed against interior walls, or buried deep within the structure. These rooms existed without windows sealed from sunlight, weather, and time. They were not mistakes. They were intentional. A room without a window did not invite reflection. It discouraged lingering. Its air was heavier, its light borrowed rather than earned. Lamps burned longer here, their glow dull and controlled. These spaces were designed not for comfort, but for function and, when necessary, for containment. Officially, such rooms served practical purposes: storage, preparation, temporary waiting. They held linens, silver, cleaning supplies, and records that required security rather than visibility. Their darkness protected valuables from fading and prying eyes alike. But this explanation only accounted for part of their existence. In practice, windowless rooms absorbed what the rest of the house could not manage openly. They became places where time slowed or stopped entirely. A person sent into such a room felt the difference immediately. Without natural light, the hours lost their markers. Morning and evening blurred. The house controlled perception as effectively as it controlled movement. A stay meant to be brief could stretch quietly, unnoticed. Servants were most familiar with these spaces. They worked in them, passed through them, waited within them when summoned. A maid might stand in a windowless corridor outside a bedchamber, listening for instruction. A footman might be sent to a dark room to prepare something that should not be observed. These tasks were never questioned. The absence of light discouraged curiosity. But there were other uses less documented, more carefully ignored. When illness arrived that required discretion, a windowless room offered privacy without explanation. No curtains needed drawing. No light betrayed activity. Care could be administered quietly, removed from the visible rhythms of the household. The house did not deny the sick. It hid them. When a family member required isolation, emotional, physical, or social, these rooms provided it seamlessly. A relative could be kept resting, without guests ever suspecting confinement. A scandal could be delayed, managed, softened over time. The house offered silence and darkness as tools of preservation. Children sensed the difference instinctively. A room without a window felt wrong even when it was not forbidden. They avoided them without instruction, aware that such spaces did not belong to ordinary life. The house trained them gently, using discomfort rather than prohibition. Sound behaved differently here. Without windows to diffuse it, noise lingered. A whisper seemed too loud, a footstep too final. Silence pressed inward, making thoughts feel heavier. These rooms encouraged restraint not through rule, but through atmosphere. At night, their presence became more pronounced. A lamp left burning in a windowless room suggested prolonged wakefulness, care, worry, or decision-making that would not resolve easily. Servants noticed. The house noticed. Yet nothing was said. These spaces existed precisely so that explanation was unnecessary. Over time, certain windowless rooms gained reputations within the household. Not spoken aloud, but understood. A room avoided unless required, a room used only under specific circumstances. The house kept these distinctions intact, even as occupants changed. When renovations occurred, these rooms were rarely altered significantly. Removing them would have required acknowledgement of their purpose. Instead, they were repurposed, renamed, or quietly sealed. Their darkness remained, preserved behind fresh paint and updated fixtures. Modern visitors sometimes encounter these rooms unexpectedly. They feel the shift immediately, the absence of air, the lack of orientation, the subtle pressure of enclosure. Guides explain them away as storage or necessity. Few linger, the house resists it. Rooms without windows reveal the Victorian mansion at its most honest. They admit that not everything was meant to be seen, and not everyone was meant to remain visible. They acknowledge, without comment, that containment was sometimes preferable to resolution. These spaces did not solve problems. They postponed them. They absorbed them. They allowed the house to continue functioning while holding what could not be addressed elsewhere. And though their lamps have long been extinguished, the darkness they were built to hold remains quiet, purposeful, and entirely intentional. Corridors were never meant to hold words. They existed to move people along, to erase presence as efficiently as possible. And yet, in Victorian mansions, it was often within these narrow passages that truth emerged quietly, unintentionally, and without ceremony. When a corridor became a confessional, it did so not by invitation but by necessity. These spaces were transitional by design. No one claimed ownership of them. They belonged to everyone and no one at once. That ambiguity made them dangerous and useful. A person pausing here was not fully present in any room, not fully accountable to any audience. The corridor offered a brief suspension of consequence. It was in these moments between doors, between duties, that restraint weakened. A servant carrying a tray might hesitate at a landing, catching the edge of a conversation meant to end behind closed doors. A family member retreating from a room might stop short, breath unsteady, words escaping before composure could return. The corridor absorbed these confessions without judgment, allowing them to pass without witness, at least in theory. The acoustics encouraged this. Sound traveled unevenly here, slipping along walls and around corners, dissolving before it could be traced back to its source. A whispered sentence could be spoken and forgotten in the same breath. The house did not demand clarity, it accepted fragments. Servants understood the corridor's role instinctively. They learned where pauses were tolerated, where walls thinned enough to carry sound, where one might overhear without appearing to listen. This knowledge was rarely abused openly. Silence remained the rule, but awareness altered behavior. A servant who heard too much learned to move on quickly or to linger just long enough to understand. For family members, corridors offered a rare release. Official rooms required performance. Private rooms demanded containment. Corridors allowed something in between. A confession spoken here did not feel final. It could be denied later, dismissed as exhaustion or frustration. The house allowed this ambiguity, offering space for truth without accountability. Sometimes these confessions were accidental. A name spoken too clearly, a grievance voiced too openly, a fear admitted before it could be corrected. Other times, they were deliberate, carefully timed exchanges meant to occur where they could not be fully owned. The corridor provided plausible deniability. At night, this function intensified. The absence of movement heightened awareness. A single voice carried farther, felt closer. Corridors became charged with possibility. A person stepping into one after hours knew they were no longer fully protected by routine. What was said here lingered longer. Children sensed this tension without understanding it. They learned that corridors were places to be quiet, not because of rules, but because something important might be happening. They passed through quickly, absorbing fragments of adult conversations that shaped their understanding of the household long before anyone explained it to them. Over time, certain corridors gained reputations. A stretch near the master bedroom where voices dropped. A passage outside the nursery where arguments softened. A landing where decisions were made quietly, away from rooms that demanded certainty. The house remembered these patterns, reinforcing them through habit rather than instruction. What makes these spaces unsettling in retrospect is how often they held the truth more accurately than any official room. Parlors displayed harmony, dining rooms performed unity, bedrooms contained tension privately. Corridors, by contrast, captured reality mid-transition, unfinished, unresolved, and unpolished. When families moved on and routines dissolved, these confessional corridors remained. New occupants felt them immediately. A place where one slowed unconsciously, where voices dropped without reason, where silence felt expectant rather than empty. The house preserved these atmospheres carefully, even as names and stories faded. The corridor did not absolve those who spoke within it. It did something quieter. It allowed truth to exist briefly without demanding action. It offered relief without resolution. And in a world built on restraint, that small mercy mattered. When a corridor became a confessional, it did so because the house understood that truth, like movement, was safest when it did not remain in one place for too long. The nursery of a Victorian mansion was rarely where visitors imagined it to be. It did not sit proudly near the heart of the house, nor was it arranged for admiration. Instead, it was tucked away up another flight of stairs, down a quieter corridor, or beyond a door that suggested storage rather than childhood. Children were present, but carefully displaced. This was not neglect, it was management. Victorian society revered the idea of childhood while remaining deeply uncomfortable with its realities. Noise, unpredictability, emotion, these did not belong in rooms designed for composure. And so the nursery was removed from the visible life of the house, placed where its disruptions could be softened before they reached public ears. The hidden nursery existed in a state of controlled separation, close enough for supervision, distant enough to be forgotten. Nannies and nurses became its primary inhabitants, their authority confined to this upper realm. Parents visited on schedule, affection administered within boundaries. The house made these divisions feel natural, inevitable. Light in the nursery was different. Windows were smaller, curtains heavier. Sound was managed carefully. Laughter rarely traveled beyond its walls, and crying was absorbed before it could descend. The house ensured that childhood remained contained, its messiness prevented from contaminating adult order. Yet this distance shaped lives. Children raised in these spaces learned early that visibility was conditional. They were allowed presence at certain hours, in certain rooms, under certain rules. The rest of the time, they belonged to the upper floors, to spaces that did not require explanation because they were not meant to be acknowledged. The hidden nursery also absorbed consequences. When a child did not fit expectations, when health faltered, behavior resisted, correction, or lineage became complicated, the nursery became quieter still. Doors closed more often. Visits shortened. The house did not judge these changes, it accommodated them. In some households, the nursery held children who were never meant to be introduced fully. infants born at inconvenient times, offspring whose existence required discretion. These children were not imprisoned, but neither were they integrated. The house offered them care without recognition, safety without legitimacy. Servants understood this arrangement clearly. Nannies carried more responsibility than acknowledgement. They shaped early lives knowing their influence would never be credited. The house reinforced this invisibility, providing spaces where devotion could exist without record. At night, the nursery changed character. Sounds traveled farther in the stillness. A cough echoed more sharply. A whispered reassurance felt heavier. The house listened carefully then, holding these moments close. Childhood vulnerability left deep impressions, and the walls remembered them long after cradles were removed. As children grew, some left the nursery and descended into family life. Others did not. A room might be repurposed quietly, its former function never mentioned again. Toys vanished. Furniture changed. Yet something remained, an atmosphere of careful restraint, a sense of lives shaped out of sight. Modern visitors often find these nurseries unsettling. They feel smaller than expected, more distant, more severe. Guides describe them as practical solutions to crowded households. What they rarely acknowledge is the emotional geography these rooms enforced. The hidden nursery reveals a truth the Victorian mansion rarely admitted aloud, that childhood was managed, not celebrated, that love existed, but within limits, that belonging was conditional. The house learned this lesson early. It carried it forward faithfully, preserving the quiet of rooms where young lives were shaped away from scrutiny. And even now, when footsteps echo through those upper halls, the house remembers small voices softened by distance, laughter carefully contained, and childhood lived just far enough away to remain acceptable. Dinner in a Victorian mansion appeared effortless. Courses arrived in precise order. Plates were replaced without interruption. Glasses refilled before they were noticed to be empty. Conversation flowed as though nothing beyond the table required attention. This was the illusion. Behind it lay a choreography of disappearance. Servants did not simply serve dinner. They dissolved into it. From the moment guests took their seats, movement became a study in restraint. Servants entered rooms from angles that avoided attention, their presence registering only as function. A dish appeared. A chair was adjusted. A spill vanished. Then, just as quickly, the person responsible was gone, absorbed by doorways that seemed to close on their own. This was not rudeness. It was discipline. Victorian etiquette demanded that labor be invisible. A well-run household was one where service occurred without evidence of effort. To linger was to intrude. To be noticed was to disrupt. The house supported this expectation, providing routes that allowed servants to approach, perform, and retreat without crossing the social center of the room. Doors opened behind screens. Panels slid silently. Corridors aligned perfectly with service points. The architecture did half the work. Servants learned to trust it, stepping backward into spaces that swallowed them immediately. From the table, it seemed as though plates moved themselves. The effect was deliberate. Guests were meant to believe the household functioned naturally, without strain. The presence of servants would have reminded them otherwise. Disappearance preserved the fantasy. This vanishing act extended beyond staff. Family members also learned how to remove themselves during dinner without causing disruption. A sudden illness, a polite excuse, a brief retreat that became permanent. The table absorbed absence without comment. Conversation adjusted. The house closed, ranks around the gap. In some households, dinner was the most controlled environment of all. Emotions were carefully managed here, disagreements postponed, news delayed. What could not be said at the table was carried away quite literally by those who disappeared into service corridors, their faces composed, their knowledge unacknowledged. Servants understood the weight of what they carried. Trays bore more than food. They held the tension of unsaid words, the aftermath of glances exchanged too sharply, the knowledge of who had left and why. This information moved quickly through the hidden parts of the house, settling where it would not be confronted. At formal dinners, disappearance became ritualized. Servants withdrew at precise moments, leaving guests alone to signal trust or to enforce restraint. The absence of staff was not freedom. It was expectation. Behavior was still governed by the house, even when no one appeared to be watching. At night, when dinners stretched longer and lamps burned lower, disappearances took on new meaning. A servant gone too long suggested trouble elsewhere. A family member leaving the table early invited speculation. The house noticed these patterns, recording them quietly. Children observed this early. They learned that dinner was not only about eating, but about performance. They learned when to speak and when to fall silent. They learned that leaving the table meant more than hunger. The house reinforced these lessons through repetition. When families aged and routines shifted, the choreography changed but never vanished entirely. Fewer courses, fewer servants, yet the instinct to disappear remained. New occupants felt it without understanding it, a tendency to excuse themselves quietly, to retreat without explanation, to avoid drawing attention to absence. Modern visitors often imagine Victorian dinners as lively gatherings filled with conversation and ceremony. What they rarely consider is how much effort went into ensuring that certain people and certain truths were never present long enough to be acknowledged. Disappearing at dinner was not avoidance, it was maintenance, a way of preserving harmony by removing friction before it could be named. The house learned this lesson well. It ensured that those who needed to vanish could do so smoothly, without leaving a mark on the evening. And long after the last plate was cleared and the last guest departed, the house remembered who had remained and who had quietly stepped away, never to return to the table again. Every Victorian mansion was crowded with lives that history never learned to name. They moved through its corridors, climbed its staircases, slept in its narrow rooms, and vanished without ceremony. Their labor sustained the house, their presence shaped its rhythms. And yet, when the doors finally closed behind them, little remained to prove they had ever been there at all. These were not strangers, they were constant. Servants who arrived before dawn and retired long after midnight, children who grew up within the house, only to be sent away quietly. Relatives who stayed for a season and never returned. Each life passed through the mansion with purpose, and each was absorbed without record. Victorian households did not erase these people out of cruelty alone. Erasure was structural. The house was designed to preserve continuity, not individuals. Names changed, roles persisted. A maid departed, another arrived. The room remained the same. The staircase remembered footsteps, not faces. Servants understood this impermanence early. Employment depended on discretion, not recognition. To leave a trace was to risk dismissal. Personal belongings were kept minimal, correspondence limited, identity reduced to function. The house rewarded this erasure with stability, food, shelter, routine, while ensuring that nothing personal lingered once service ended. Bedrooms assigned to servants reflected this philosophy. Small, plain, interchangeable, no space encouraged attachment. A room could be emptied and refilled within hours, its previous occupant replaced without disturbance. The house did not pause to acknowledge the transition. It continued. Family members were not immune to this process. Those who failed to fit the household's narrative often faded quietly. A daughter sent to live elsewhere. A relative described vaguely and rarely mentioned again. A child raised apart from public life. Their absence became normal through repetition. The house adjusted, absorbing the gap without comment. Illness accelerated this erasure. A person confined upstairs, cared for discreetly, gradually disappeared from daily life. Meals continued. Guests arrived. Conversations avoided names. When the room was eventually vacated, it was repurposed quickly. Curtains were changed, furniture rearranged. The house moved on. What remains unsettling is how efficiently this forgetting occurred. No confrontation was required, no declaration made. Silence did the work. The house facilitated it by offering spaces where lives could diminish without disrupting the visible order of things. Servants were often witnesses to these disappearances. They noticed when footsteps ceased, when bells stopped ringing, when a room no longer required attention. They rarely spoke of it. Silence protected them as much as it protected the household. The house remembered their knowledge even when history did not. Children sensed these absences acutely. They noticed when someone stopped appearing at meals, when a voice vanished from corridors. Explanations were sparse. The house taught them to accept disappearance as part of life's structure. Questions dissolved into routine. Over decades, these vanished lives accumulated. The house grew heavy with them, not as ghosts, but as impressions. A chair positioned oddly, a door never opened, a room avoided without explanation. New occupants felt these presences without understanding them. The house had learned to hold what could not be acknowledged. Estate records rarely mention these people. Census entries reduced them to initials and ages. Letters omitted them entirely. Yet without their presence, the mansion could not have functioned. They were its unseen foundation. When houses were finally abandoned or converted into museums, this absence became more pronounced. Visitors admired architecture, furniture, lineage. They rarely asked about the hundreds of lives that sustained it quietly. The house did not volunteer the information. It had been trained not to. Lives that left no trace were not unimportant. They were essential. Their erasure was the cost of maintaining continuity, respectability, and illusion. The house preserved its own narrative by letting theirs disappear. And though no portraits bear their likeness and no documents record their stories, the mansion remembers them all, each footstep worn into stairs, each pause absorbed by walls, each life folded into silence and carried forward, unacknowledged but never entirely gone. In the heart of every Victorian mansion, a marriage was displayed as if it were architecture itself. It occupied the drawing room, the dining room, the spaces where guests could observe and confirm propriety. Symmetry of posture, timing of conversation, and coordination of gestures created the illusion of harmony. And yet, behind the polished façade, the truth often diverged from expectation. A marriage that looked perfect was a performance first and a relationship second. Husbands and wives moved according to social rhythm before personal inclination. Every greeting, every farewell, every glance was measured to maintain equilibrium. The house itself supported this choreography. Rooms provided controlled space. Lighting softened faults. Furniture guided posture. The environment dictated behavior almost as much as etiquette did. Guests rarely recognized the distance. They witnessed laughter, small touches, nods of agreement, and assumed contentment. Every observer confirmed the house's claim that all was well. And for those inside, the pressure to maintain appearances was constant. A lapse, a sigh too long, a glance too sharp, risked exposure, embarrassment, or social censure. The house absorbed these risks and distributed them carefully, punishing with subtle discomfort rather than overt confrontation. Bedrooms told a different story. While public spaces demanded consistency, private chambers revealed fractures. Doors closed softly to obscure argument, to hide exhaustion, to conceal desire that did not align with expectation. The house offered these spaces as refuge, yet imposed constraints. Sound traveled unpredictably, walls absorbed meaning, and shadows elongated every hesitation. Privacy here was contingent, not absolute. Even rituals of affection were constrained. A hand placed on an arm, a whispered compliment, a fleeting touch, each was negotiated according to time, location, and visibility. Spontaneity was dangerous. Timing was everything. The mansion's architecture enforced restraint. Hallways funneled movement. Staircases directed attention. Rooms imposed posture. The house ensured that performance extended seamlessly into private life. Servants played an essential role. They observed without comment, intervened when necessary, and vanished when discretion demanded. They became intermediaries between public harmony and private truth, carrying meals, messages, or advice along routes no visitor would notice. They understood the balance and maintained it silently. The mansion depended on them as much as it did on the couple performing within its walls. Children, too, internalized this performance. They learned early what it meant to appear content. Observing the measured conduct of their parents, they understood that discontent was dangerous to display. Behavior was corrected silently through glance and gesture, rather than explanation. The house reinforced these lessons with its structure: narrow corridors, angled staircases, rooms that guided movement subtly. Over time, the disparity between appearance and reality grew. Visitors continued to witness harmony, while the occupants learned to navigate tension. Words unspoken accumulated, resentments expanded quietly, and desires redirected themselves into hidden spaces. The house held all of this in suspension. It recorded without judgment, providing the illusion that everything was aligned. At night, the disparity became more evident to those within. Lamps lowered, shadows deepened, and silence invited reflection. The couple moved through the house with awareness, avoiding unnecessary conversation, keeping expressions composed. Even in private, the mansion demanded that appearances persist, preserving a facade for the household itself. The marriage that looked perfect existed because the house allowed it. Not because love was constant or contentment natural, but because the mansion was trained to absorb discord, to facilitate restraint, and to present only the image that society required. It was a structure of perception as much as it was a home. And in this careful orchestration, the Victorian mansion ensured that harmony appeared effortless, regardless of what was whispered behind closed doors, hidden in shadow, or carried silently through corridors where no eyes observed and no voices questioned. In a Victorian mansion, bedrooms were more than places of rest. They were instruments of separation, negotiation, and subtle control. Doors did not simply provide entry or privacy, they defined relationships, managed behavior, and enforced propriety. Bedrooms with separate doors were deliberate, signaling the boundaries of intimacy even when intimacy was expected. These rooms were arranged to balance visibility and discretion. A couple might share a floor, yet enter their chambers by different routes. A daughter's room might be placed across a corridor from her parents', visible yet inaccessible without permission. A servant's quarters often lay adjacent, accessible only through hidden passages. Each door carried authority. Each hinge dictated behavior. Access was a matter of social, as much as architectural design. Privacy in such rooms was conditional. A door closed softly behind a person did not guarantee solitude, only containment. Walls listened, corridors whispered, and ceilings absorbed sound in ways that could reveal indiscretion without proving it. The mansion itself acted as both guardian and observer, ensuring that actions within the room remained bounded by the household's expectations. Couples learned the lesson quickly. Interaction was choreographed according to entrances and exits. A husband might knock, then wait precisely 3 beats before entering. A wife might leave her chamber quietly, passing unnoticed along a service corridor before reaching the parlor. The house facilitated these movements, creating invisible lanes of propriety that ensured appearances were preserved even when emotions or desires were not. Children absorbed the signals too. A door left open suggested invitation. One closed quietly implied prohibition. Curiosity was tempered by instinct and observation. Over time, the structure of the house educated them as thoroughly as any tutor. Movement, access, and retreat were internalized as extensions of social order. Servants relied on these doors to maintain discretion. A locked chamber could hide illness, discontent, or scandal. A passage leading to the master's bedroom allowed intervention without visibility. Meals, letters, and small necessities were delivered through these hidden channels, preserving the illusion of seamless operation above. Every lock, every latch, every knob reinforced the hierarchy and contained knowledge that must not escape. The bedrooms themselves were silent witnesses. Their walls, lined with wood and plaster, absorbed the rhythms of hidden life. Furniture arranged according to expectation guided posture and behavior. Curtains were heavy enough to obscure sight, but light enough to allow air to circulate without revealing movement. Lamps were positioned to create pools of light that permitted activity while concealing detail. The mansion ensured that even intimate moments were framed according to decorum. At night, the architecture's influence intensified. The house required obedience in stillness. Doors were closed methodically, footsteps muted, voices lowered. Shadows deepened in the corners, shaping perception and experience. What occurred within a bedroom was contained, yet its traces influenced the atmosphere beyond, informing where people walked, how they spoke, and when they remained present. Over time, these separate doors became symbols of power, control, and discretion. They delineated who could enter, when, and under what circumstances. They shaped relationships without confrontation. They provided safety, though it was a careful, conditional kind. Absence and presence were negotiated silently through the turn of a key, the soft swing of a hinge, or the simple closing of a door. Modern visitors often overlook these features. They see a bedroom and assume equality of space, access, and visibility. They do not notice the subtle orchestration of movement, the quiet lessons taught in shadows, the invisible barriers that governed lives. Yet, the house remembers all. Every door swing, every creak, every locked or unlocked hinge is stored in memory, silently preserving the rules of propriety. Bedrooms with separate doors reveal the mansion at its most deliberate, a structure built to contain not just bodies, but behavior, desire, and secrecy, an architecture of discretion in which privacy and control are inseparable and appearances remain unbroken, no matter what occurs behind closed doors. In a Victorian mansion, the arrival of a guest was never a simple event. Every presence was measured, every movement assessed, and every stay limited by subtle rules known only to those who managed the household. A guest who stayed too long threatened not merely the rhythm of service, but the very illusion the house maintained. And yet, prolongation occurred, whether through circumstance, insistence, or neglect, revealing the house's capacity for quiet endurance and quiet judgment. Guests were always visible. Their entrances were ceremonious, their exits carefully noted. The house responded immediately to their presence. Carpets brushed clean, lamps positioned for effect, curtains adjusted to optimize both comfort and impression. Floors absorbed footsteps deliberately, producing a gentle cadence that reinforced authority. A visitor's stay was managed as if it were a performance, a series of acts in which the mansion itself was director and silent arbiter. But when a guest overstayed, the balance was disrupted. Dining arrangements shifted to accommodate them. Rooms were rearranged for privacy without confrontation. Corridors that had facilitated movement now funneled tension, subtle and unavoidable. The mansion absorbed the strain of overextension, allowing the household to maintain appearances while quietly recalibrating its operations. In practice, a prolonged guest was both visible and invisible. They occupied the drawing room or parlor during official hours, engaging in conversation and performing the expected attentiveness. Yet behind the walls, the house adjusted hallways that had been empty became passageways for discreet service. Bedrooms that had once been isolated were pressed into temporary accommodation. The mansion ensured that the guest's extended presence left no apparent disruption, even as it silently recorded every deviation from routine. Servants learned quickly how to manage overstays. They moved silently, ensuring meals arrived punctually, messages reached the right hands, and privacy was maintained for both family and guest. They became intermediaries in an invisible negotiation, prolonging attention without revealing irritation, providing comfort without betraying constraint. In doing so, they reinforced the mansion's authority, its ability to absorb imbalance and maintain the performance of order. Even family members were affected. The appearance of calm required careful choreography. Conversations were measured, gestures restrained. A glance exchanged across the room had to be precise. The house subtly dictated behavior, shaping interactions without need for explicit instruction. Bedrooms became retreats for temporary escape, corridors conduits for careful avoidance, and lamps, lowered or raised, the only indicator that the household's tolerance was finite. At night, the prolonged guest altered the mansion's rhythm further. Gaslight cast longer shadows, amplifying the sense of constraint. Servants whispered behind doors, their footsteps measured, and the quiet hum of unseen activity marked the subtle reclaiming of control. The house absorbed the intrusion, not passively, but actively, ensuring that every corridor, every door, and every room maintained the delicate balance of appearances. Guests rarely noticed this orchestration. To them, the house seemed gracious, effortless, serene. Yet every extra hour of presence required silent negotiation, a careful rebalancing of authority, and a subtle adjustment to light, sound, and movement. The mansion remembered. It recorded the prolonged footsteps, the unguarded words, the interruptions to routine, storing them quietly in the fabric of the house. When the guest finally departed, it appeared seamless. Meals continued as though nothing had changed. Rooms returned to prior arrangements. Family and staff moved through the house in familiar patterns. Yet the house retained the memory of the overextension, embedding it into the walls, stairs, and corridors, a quiet testament to the fact that nothing within its domain escaped notice or consequence. In a Victorian mansion, even the most innocuous overstay became part of the architecture's living record. The house tolerated, accommodated, and remembered, preserving its illusion of order while quietly cataloguing every deviation from the expected rhythm. It was both witness and judge, silent yet persistent, and always entirely in control. In a Victorian mansion, letters carried weight far beyond the words they contained. They were instruments of connection, evidence of affection, proof of obligation, and occasionally instruments of concealment. Some letters never survived the day. They were burned before morning, their existence erased by design, circumstance, or necessity. The house, ever attentive, witnessed these gestures with the quiet patience of stone. The act of burning a letter was ritualized, deliberate, and almost ceremonial. A fire was stoked quietly in the hearth, its glow soft and forgiving. The writer or recipient approached with folded paper in hand, aware that a single crease misaligned or an ash left unchecked could betray intent. Flames licked the edges of the parchment, curling ink and dissolving words into smoke. Each flicker was a small absolution, a final act of discretion. These letters often contained truths that could not survive daylight. Confessions, transgressions, longings, grievances, all of these were safer consumed by fire than shared aloud. The mansion's architecture encouraged such discretion. Writing desks were placed in corners that received little attention, chairs angled to avoid windows, curtains drawn to obscure the act. The house, with its walls, shadows, and doors, facilitated secrecy. Servants were trained to respect this privacy implicitly. They knew the times and locations where correspondence was handled and when to disappear silently. A maid might leave the room with a tray of tea, a footman might adjust a lamp, all without acknowledging the paper held in careful hands. Their movements were part of the mansion's choreography, maintaining appearances while discreetly preserving secrets. Even family members learned the utility of letters as instruments of concealment. A son could convey instruction without confrontation, a daughter could express longing without exposure, and a husband or wife could negotiate affairs in a manner invisible to observers. Letters allowed communication across distance, time, and circumstance, while the fire ensured that evidence of impropriety never lingered. Burning letters before morning also served as a practical necessity. Early hours were easier to control, no visitor could arrive to witness the act, and no domestic disturbance could interrupt it. Night's shadows softened every gesture. The house seemed to participate in the act, absorbing the faint rustle of paper, the heat from the flames, the odor of ink and ash. In this way, destruction became a quiet, almost invisible collaboration between occupant and architecture. Some letters were destroyed in haste, urgent erasures of words written in error, passion, or anger. Others were preserved for ritual, consumed only after careful consideration, their ashes carefully swept into the hearth, their memory faintly recorded in the dust. The mansion retained the imprint of these events in subtle ways, the faint odor of smoke in a corner, a slightly darkened stone, the placement of a chair where it had always been. Over time, the practice left its mark on the household's rhythm. Guests never noticed the absence of correspondence. Rooms appeared orderly, undisturbed. Family members internalized the habit, understanding that not all words were meant to survive, and that discretion was as much a responsibility as decorum. The house silently approved, ensuring that no trace remained beyond what it permitted. When the morning light entered, it found only order. The papers were gone, the fire reduced to quiet embers. The house returned to its daytime performance, structured, respectable, and undisturbed. Yet it remembered. Every letter consumed, every whisper of ink burned into smoke, became part of the mansion's silent archive. In Victorian households, letters burned before morning were more than communication destroyed. They were instruments of survival, of appearance, of secrecy. And the house, ever watchful, held their memory, preserving the balance between what had been said, what could never be spoken aloud, and what would remain forever unseen. In the architecture of a Victorian mansion, some areas were deliberately rendered inaccessible. A door swung shut and locked, not for security alone, but to contain, conceal, and control. These locked wings were extensions of the house's will, a place where secrets could be stored, indiscretions quarantined, and discretion maintained. They were as much a tool of social management as they were of architecture. The locked wing was rarely marked. From the outside, it appeared as an ordinary part of the house, a continuation of the corridor, a series of windows that reflected the same light, a roofline that aligned perfectly with the rest. Yet the door, often plain, unremarkable, intentionally uninviting, concealed a space that no casual observer could enter. Its lock was a reminder that certain realms were beyond reach, even to those who lived within the house. Authority extended not merely through hierarchy, but through the absence of access. These wings were seldom empty. They held rooms that were repurposed as necessary, a nursery for a child not yet acknowledged publicly, a bedroom for a guest whose stay required discretion, a study for correspondence that must not be seen. Illness, grief, or scandal could be contained behind these doors, managed quietly and without witness. The house absorbed the presence of those confined here, holding the space steady while the rest of the household continued its performance of order. Servants were keenly aware of these wings. They learned the rhythm of keys, the timing of when access might be permitted, the routes that allowed them to service these areas without exposure. Every step in the corridor leading to a locked wing required care. Too fast, and attention might be drawn. Too slow, and suspicion could arise. Silence was essential, both to protect the occupants and to maintain the illusion of calm throughout the household. Family members understood the function of the locked wing intuitively, though rarely openly acknowledged it. It offered safety, but at a cost: isolation. A person sent there learned to adapt quickly to the absence of attention, the altered light, and the peculiar stillness of rooms not designed for habitation. Windows, when present, were small and positioned to admit air but not observation. Gaslight provided only a muted glow, sufficient for activity but inadequate for leisure or display. The house enforced its lessons through environment rather than admonition. Over time, locked wings accumulated history. A room sealed for a single season might be used repeatedly, its purpose evolving with each occupant. Furniture shifted quietly to accommodate new needs, yet the lock remained a constant, a reminder of control, discretion, and the boundaries of what could be permitted. Even when keys changed hands, the principle persisted. Some areas were never fully public, never fully accountable. The impact of these wings extended beyond their immediate walls. The very knowledge of a locked space shaped behavior in adjacent rooms. Guests were guided away, children learned instinctively where not to linger, servants adjusted their routes. Silence became layered, restraint reinforced, and appearances preserved. The house orchestrated these effects as thoroughly as it managed light or temperature. Night intensified their presence. Shadows pooled in corners, sounds echoed strangely through empty corridors. The house seemed to breathe around these locked areas, maintaining vigilance even without eyes or ears. A single key could open or seal a domain, but the memory of restriction persisted even when the door remained closed. Modern visitors seldom comprehend the locked wing's significance. They see it as an empty or unused space, or a simple architectural curiosity. Yet in a Victorian mansion, the locked wing represents the household at its most disciplined, the embodiment of control, secrecy, and discretion. It preserves the illusion that the house functions smoothly while quietly storing the truths that cannot be faced, the people who must remain unseen, and the events that must never be acknowledged. In the locked wing, the mansion demonstrates its ultimate lesson, that invisibility is not absence, secrecy is not chaos, and the house itself can enforce both with the patience of stone. It waits, it remembers, and it continues, quietly, unyielding, and entirely in control. In a Victorian mansion, the existence of a mistress was acknowledged only in absence. She was present in the rhythm of the household, in the subtle arrangements of rooms and corridors, yet her name was rarely spoken aloud. These women inhabited a delicate shadow visible through implication, invisible in designation. The house absorbed their presence, accommodating desire while preserving appearances, and in doing so, taught those within the subtle lesson that certain truths could never be named. A mistress without a name existed primarily through proximity and timing. Her arrival was unannounced to guests, her movements discreet, her interactions carefully measured. Bedrooms, studies, and corridors were arranged to allow her to enter and exit without scrutiny, often utilizing hidden passageways or narrow staircases invisible to the family or visitors. She could be in a room where the family dined, yet remain unnoticed. She could pass through a hallway where children played, yet leave no trace. The mansion itself facilitated this invisibility. Her presence influenced the household in countless ways. Staff learned the unspoken rules immediately. They knew which doors must remain closed, which lamps dimmed, which corridors to avoid. Footsteps were measured, conversations were tempered. The house itself seemed to participate in her discretion, absorbing sound, bending light, and shaping movement to permit function without exposure. Service continued as though nothing unusual had occurred, but the rhythm of activity subtly shifted to accommodate the shadowed life. For the family, the mistress existed as both a reality and a denial. Her influence might be felt in the mood of a drawing room, the timing of a visit, or the allocation of a favored bedroom, yet acknowledgement was carefully avoided. To speak her name risked scandal. To ignore her presence risked disrupting the balance the house had cultivated. She was a constant, silent participant in the household's performance, her existence regulated as rigorously as light, temperature, or decorum. Bedrooms were particularly significant in her accommodation. Often situated in wings removed from the main family quarters, these rooms provided privacy without visibility. Windows were small or oriented to prevent observation. Lamps were low, casting soft shadows that allowed occupancy without attention. Even furnishings were chosen for discretion. Chairs positioned to suggest function rather than comfort. Beds aligned to obscure occupancy from corridors. The mansion absorbed her presence as though it were part of its structure, recognizing authority while demanding secrecy. Evenings heightened the tension of anonymity. The household moved through familiar routines, yet the mistress's movements introduced subtle unpredictability. Servants adjusted quietly. Family members maintained composure, and the house itself seemed to bend to accommodate this silent influence. Every door, every corridor, every lamp became a participant in her concealment. Her invisibility was reinforced not only by her discretion, but by the very architecture she occupied. Over time, the mistress left marks without leaving evidence. A chair worn slightly in a hidden corridor, a faint indentation in a rug. The air smelled subtly of perfume where no visitor expected it. These traces were perceptible only to those attuned to the rhythms of the mansion, absorbed unnoticed by casual observers. The house remembered them. It recorded presence without acknowledgement, shaping memory without proof. To modern eyes, a mistress without a name seems almost mythic, yet in the life of the mansion, she was as real as its walls, as present as its gaslight, as influential as its architecture. She taught the household lessons in discretion, movement, and silence. She demonstrated that existence could be acknowledged without being named, observed without being seen, and influence exerted without recognition. The Victorian mansion, in its patient and deliberate architecture, became a sanctuary for this invisibility. Every door closed quietly. Every corridor bent just so. Every lamp dimmed precisely to allow her life to unfold unseen. And long after her presence faded, the house retained the memory silent, unspoken, and utterly permanent. In a Victorian mansion, the servants were the unseen custodians of truth. They moved invisibly through corridors, up staircases, and behind closed doors, observing the lives of those above with a precision born of necessity. They were witnesses to what was allowed to be seen and what was meant to remain concealed, learning details that no guest, no family member, and often no historian would ever record. These were the servants who knew everything. Their knowledge began with routine. They delivered meals, prepared rooms, tended fires, and polished surfaces, all under strict instruction to remain unnoticed. In the process, they absorbed information, the hushed conversation in a nursery, the subtle tension in a drawing room, the hurried passage of a mistress through a hidden stairwell. Nothing escaped their observation. Every gesture, every whispered word, every glance carried meaning they were trained to interpret without acknowledgement. Servants understood hierarchy with a clarity that sometimes eluded the family. They knew which doors they could enter without invitation and which keys were off limits. They recognized the rhythms of private life, the hours when children were allowed unsupervised, when bedrooms were off limits, when the house itself seemed to shift its rules for discrete activity. In this way, they became integral to the mansion's function, operating not merely as laborers, but as interpreters and enforcers of its unspoken laws. Yet knowledge carried its own weight. The servants held secrets in the air, in the walls, in the rhythm of steps and the placement of objects. A faintly ajar door might signal illness, absence, or transgression. A missing tray might indicate deception, miscommunication, or intention. They absorbed these signs with the same quiet diligence they applied to polishing silver or adjusting a lamp. To speak was forbidden. Silence was both survival and discipline. Some secrets were trivial, others grave. A quarrel resolved quietly, a letter burned in a hidden hearth, a visitor escorted through unseen passages, all passed through the servants' awareness. They carried this knowledge without revealing it, understanding that disclosure could imperil themselves, the household, or the careful equilibrium the mansion demanded. The house relied on this discretion as much as it relied on the solidity of its walls. Over time, servants became extensions of the mansion itself. They learned which footsteps required caution, which voices indicated danger, which rooms contained truths best left undisturbed. The house absorbed their labor, and in return, it allowed them intimate knowledge of lives carefully curated for outward appearance. They were observers of repetition, monitors of behavior, guardians of the invisible lines that separated propriety from indiscretion. Children learned from them as well. They noticed the glances, the pauses, the careful avoidance of certain spaces. They internalized lessons about timing, discretion, and the consequences of visibility long before they were old enough to understand the social mechanics at work. The servants, in this way, shaped the household subtly, ensuring that conduct conformed to expectation even without direct instruction. Even after years, the mansion preserved these traces. New occupants often sense the rhythm of knowledge, still present the slight pause in a corridor, the subtle adjustment of a lamp, the way a room seemed to lean toward discretion. Though the individuals who once moved unseen had departed, the house remembered the patterns of observation they had established. The servants who knew everything were never acknowledged, yet their influence was absolute. They ensured that the household functioned, that appearances were maintained, and that secrets remained contained. Their knowledge became part of the mansion's architecture, embedded in its walls, its staircases, and its shadowed corners. And long after their footsteps faded, the house continued to listen, remember, and preserve the intricate balance they had maintained in silence. When night fell over a Victorian mansion, the nursery transformed. By day, it was a carefully managed space, toys arranged with attention, books displayed for moral instruction, curtains drawn to allow sunlight for learning and play. After midnight, however, it became a different realm entirely, a space governed by quiet, shadows, and the persistence of hidden truths. Children asleep during the day awakened in a manner of perception, sensing the absence of adult presence and the stillness that had settled over the house. The nursery, tucked away from public corridors, became their private world. The room was illuminated only by the soft glow of a single lamp or the faint silver of moonlight slipping through small, high windows. Shadows stretched along walls and ceiling, casting familiar objects into unfamiliar forms. The toys, once innocuous, now seemed to occupy their own deliberate positions, waiting, watching, silently observing. Servants, too, operated differently during these hours. A nurse might linger in the doorway, ensuring that the children were settled, yet avoiding intrusion. Footsteps were measured, movements slowed, voices hushed. The house itself facilitated discretion. Its thick walls absorbed noise, corridors funneled sound away, and doors were aligned so that care could be administered without awakening curiosity from adjoining rooms. Every element conspired to maintain quiet authority while allowing necessary vigilance. It was during these hours that the nursery became an arena of subtle education. Children learned through observation, not instruction. They absorbed the rhythms of the house, the muffled footsteps that signaled attention without interference, the distant sound of a door closing to mark absence, the faint aroma of ink from a letter burned elsewhere in the mansion. The nursery taught caution, patience, and discretion without words, just as the entire household had been trained in the art of silence. Yet the nursery after midnight was also a space where anxieties manifested. The absence of daytime order magnified small disturbances, a creaking floorboard, the rustle of curtains, the shadow of a hand passing across a wall. Children interpreted these with the heightened awareness that only darkness can provide. Fears and curiosities that had been disciplined into quietude during daylight found release in whispers, in sighs, and sometimes in tears. The house absorbed these emotions with the same neutrality it applied to all movement, maintaining the overall balance of the household. This nocturnal version of the nursery also accommodated necessity. Illness could be tended discreetly. A fevered child might be moved to a hidden chamber or visited by a nurse, all without drawing attention from sleeping parents or the rest of the household. The house allowed intervention while preserving the appearance of uninterrupted sleep. Its design ensured that care could be administered invisibly, reinforcing the mansion's broader function of containment without disruption. Over the years, the nursery became a repository for these unrecorded activities. Every night patterns were established, which toys were displaced, which doors opened more quietly, which passages were used to retreat. The house memorized these rhythms, embedding them into its very structure. Future occupants, whether child or adult, were guided unconsciously by the traces left behind, the subtle placement of furniture, the wear on carpets, the faint warmth of a lamp in a habitual spot. Visitors seldom appreciated this aspect of a mansion. They saw nurseries as quaint, cheerful spaces, unaware that the house had trained generations to move carefully, observe discreetly, and understand consequence through shadowed experience. The nursery after midnight was an exercise in discipline, discretion, and quiet education, a microcosm of the household itself. In this way, the Victorian nursery performed its final duty. It contained more than children. It contained knowledge, emotion, and the rhythms of unseen life. It preserved them silently, teaching restraint without words, and leaving a memory of presence that the daylight rooms could never record. The house remembered everything, and the nursery after midnight was one of its most patient, enduring witnesses. Victorian mansions were designed to maintain order, conceal weakness, and preserve appearances. Yet no architecture could fully shield a household from the fragility of the human body. Illness, faintness, and nervous agitation often visited, and when they did, they were treated with the same subtlety as secrets, with discretion, careful placement, and the quiet authority of the house itself. Doctors, summoned to these houses, moved within a world already structured to contain them, their role both clinical and social. A doctor's visit was never routine. It was orchestrated. Lamps were lowered to avoid unflattering shadows, curtains drawn to preserve privacy, and furniture subtly repositioned to allow movement without observation. The household ensured that the professional could observe the patient, yet remain largely invisible to guests. The house itself guided his passage, narrow corridors, quiet staircases, and doorways angled to prevent casual intrusion. Every step, every adjustment, was part of an unspoken choreography of discretion. Illness was treated as both physical and social. Symptoms might be exaggerated for attention or concealed for reputation. Nerves, those delicate, often invisible disturbances, required particular attention. A trembling hand, a flushed cheek, a quiet sigh, were signs interpreted not only by the physician but by the house itself. Servants knew which rooms to prepare for consultation, which corridors to avoid, and when silence was not merely polite, but essential. The mansion absorbed the disturbances, preventing them from spilling into spaces where decorum reigned. Doctors learned the mansion's rules quickly. They arrived equipped with knowledge, tools, and authority, yet had to navigate invisible restrictions. A consultation often occurred in a private chamber, distant from the drawing room, close to the bedrooms, yet isolated enough to contain the patient's vulnerability. Gaslight softened the details of illness, while walls absorbed sound and shadow ensured discretion. The doctor's presence was acknowledged, but never sensationalized. The house, patient and observant, mediated the encounter. The role of discretion extended to the family as well. Parents and relatives learned to present calm even while observing distress, to maintain composure while the doctor assessed the nervous body, and to allow interventions without exposure. Children were trained in silence, understanding that the appearance of normalcy was as important as the care itself. The mansion reinforced this, its architecture shaping behavior as subtly as any tutor or governess. Letters, keys, and locked doors often intersected with medical care. Instructions left for the household, prescriptions carried discreetly, or temporary isolation of a patient were all accommodated by design. Even the most minor interventions were carried out under the guidance of walls, corridors, and hidden stairs. The mansion ensured that illness could be addressed while social stability remained unbroken. Over time, doctors' visits became part of the rhythm of the house. Servants knew how to prepare, the family understood when to act, and the house itself adapted to the intrusion. Illness was managed, nerves were soothed, and discretion preserved. Every encounter left traces in the mansion's memory. The placement of furniture, the faint odor of medicinal tinctures, the softened echo of footsteps, the slight creak of a floorboard near the patient's bed. When the physician departed, the house returned to its daytime posture, ordered, composed, and seemingly unaffected. Yet it retained the subtle knowledge of what had occurred, an imprint of vulnerability contained within its walls. Doctors, nerves, and discretion intertwined in a quiet system, teaching the household that even frailty could be accommodated without compromising appearances. In this way, the Victorian mansion became more than shelter. It became a participant in care, a mediator of propriety, and a silent guardian of the truths that could not be spoken aloud. And in every consultation, it demonstrated its enduring lesson. Discretion, like structure, was essential, and the house would always preserve it. In the architecture of a Victorian mansion, love was rarely private. It existed as a series of gestures, glances, and moments carefully regulated by walls, doors, and the unyielding scrutiny of both family and house. Affection was not only observed by those present, but recorded silently in the space itself, transforming sentiment into evidence. The mansion absorbed every action, every pause, every touch, turning intimacy into something measurable, managed, and, at times, perilous. Courts of propriety presided over daily life. A hand brushed too long against another, a glance lingered where it should have passed, or a whispered word exceeded its bounds and the house registered it. Lamps softened light to conceal, corridors angled to obscure, yet the imprint of interaction remained. Even when the family believed affection confined to privacy, the house preserved the memory of it as carefully as it preserved silence, shadows, and footsteps. Servants were the first witnesses. They moved along invisible routes, attending to the mundane while absorbing the subtle signals of desire and attachment. They learned which rooms were likely to host encounters, which corridors concealed movement, and which doors must remain closed to prevent observation. A letter left unattended, a hastily extinguished lamp, a faintly displaced chair, all spoke to them of intimacy that must be acknowledged only by the house itself. For the family, love became a matter of strategy. Courting, marriage, and affection were performed within bounds carefully dictated by social expectation. Public spaces, drawing rooms, dining halls, parlors displayed composure, politeness, and alignment. Private chambers offered opportunity, but always within limits. One could step toward passion, but only along the path prescribed by the architecture. Every doorway, every landing, every stair angled intentionally to direct action, ensuring that affection did not breach the boundaries set by decorum. Rooms themselves recorded these acts silently. Beds pressed against the walls knew the weight of presence. Chairs retained the subtle curve of posture. Mirrors reflected proximity, while failing to reveal intent fully. Even carpets retained impressions of footsteps, mapping movement across space. A whispered name, a trembling hand, a moment of concealed laughter, all became part of the mansion's memory. In time, the house learned to distinguish between gesture and intent, preserving each nuance with neutral fidelity. When disputes arose from forbidden or inconvenient love, the mansion accommodated both concealment and confrontation. Corridors offered escape routes, hidden passages permitted secret visits, locked doors provided both refuge and evidence. A parent might discover a trace of impropriety without witnessing the act itself. A guest might infer attachment from subtle shifts in posture, and the house held all of it equally. Love was recorded, managed, and, if necessary, contained. Even children understood the implications. They learned early that gestures could be observed, overheard, or remembered. Play became a rehearsal in discretion. Whispers and glances taught the difference between acceptable and dangerous intimacy. The mansion trained them subtly, through spatial cues and the silent responses of its architecture, in the art of managing desire under observation. By night, the effect intensified. Shadows deepened, gaslight softened, and rooms became laboratories for affection. Every movement was magnified, every sound preserved. The house converted these nocturnal encounters into evidence, retaining memory without judgment. By morning, the traces were invisible to all except the mansion itself. In the Victorian household, love was never entirely private. It became a set of signals, carefully encoded and absorbed by the house. Walls, doors, and corridors transformed intimacy into evidence. Teaching those within that emotion was both permitted and surveilled. And through it all, the mansion remained impartial, recording every act without comment, a silent witness to the complexity of affection under the weight of propriety. Some rooms in a Victorian mansion were designed not only to be entered, but to be sealed. Bedrooms that locked from the outside were instruments of control as much as of privacy. They imposed order, enforced discretion, and allowed the household to manage both the vulnerable and the inconvenient. To occupy such a room was to understand that presence came with conditions, and that absence could be enforced without confrontation. These bedrooms were often located in wings, set apart from the main floors, accessible by corridors that guided movement carefully. Doors were fitted with locks intended for authority, not convenience. A key hung with a trusted servant or family member, its use deliberate and rare. The lock communicated ownership, control, and expectation. To be inside was to accept the terms, to be excluded was to acknowledge them. Occupants of these rooms were acutely aware of their restrictions. The space itself conveyed the rules. Furniture aligned to prevent lingering, windows small or high to deny observation while admitting necessary light, and gas lamps positioned to illuminate without inviting scrutiny. Every element instructed behavior, shaping conduct as thoroughly as any spoken admonition. Such bedrooms served multiple functions. They could isolate illness, conceal shame, or contain indiscretion. A child in need of quiet supervision might be placed here. A guest whose presence was awkward could be accommodated safely. Even family members who required reflection or restraint could retreat to these rooms, learning the value of seclusion enforced without comment. The house mediated every act within, ensuring that discretion remained intact. Servants understood the implications immediately. They moved along prescribed routes to deliver meals, tend fires, and administer care, all while remaining unseen. Footsteps were measured, voices lowered, lamps adjusted. The house guided them, offering architecture as instruction. Every step, every knock, every key turn reinforced the rules without the need for explanation. These bedrooms also encoded subtle social hierarchies. To lock a door from the outside was to assert authority, often in ways more lasting than a spoken order. Occupants became temporarily invisible, their movements confined by design. The room preserved respectability by containing behavior that might otherwise disturb appearances elsewhere in the house. And in doing so, it reinforced the broader lesson. Propriety was architecture as much as performance. At night, the effect of these locked bedrooms intensified. Shadows pooled more deeply, gaslight softened yet further, and silence settled like a tangible presence. The occupant moved within an ordered world, aware that absence could be enforced even in their presence. The house itself seemed to breathe around the room, vigilant and impartial, maintaining balance through structure alone. Even after the occupant departed, traces remained. Carpets softened by repeated passage, furniture shifted slightly underweight, hinges creaked subtly with the memory of use. The house preserved the impact of authority without requiring a witness. New occupants would sense the weight of control in the room's proportions and arrangements, understanding instinctively the boundaries it imposed. Bedrooms that locked from the outside reveal the Victorian mansion at its most deliberate, a structure designed to maintain appearances, manage behavior, and contain what society could not accommodate openly. They were both sanctuary and instrument, teaching that obedience and discretion were inseparable. And within these walls, the house remembered every enforced seclusion, preserving the lesson long after those who occupied the room had vanished. Every Victorian mansion contained rooms that seemed necessary yet were seldom touched. The spare room, polished, orderly, prepared, stood in patient expectation, a symbol of propriety more than utility. It existed to suggest preparedness, to reassure guests, and to reinforce hierarchy. Yet, for all its readiness, it was rarely used, its stillness becoming part of the mansion's careful orchestration of appearances. At first glance, the spare room appeared ordinary, a bed made with precision, curtains drawn neatly, furniture aligned with symmetry, mirrors reflecting the room in perfection. Yet its emptiness was deliberate. It was not intended for ordinary use. It was meant to exist as evidence of readiness, a statement that the house could accommodate, that the family maintained control, and that appearances were never neglected. It served as proof that no contingency was beyond management. The placement of these rooms was deliberate, often tucked away near corridors seldom traveled or at the end of wings that were themselves removed from public space. The spare room remained accessible yet invisible. Its doors were designed to blend seamlessly with paneling. Its windows, if present, were modest, admitting only faint light to suggest habitation without revealing detail. The mansion protected it from scrutiny while asserting the household's capacity for order. Servants understood the room's dual purpose. They maintained it meticulously, dusting, polishing, adjusting bedclothes, and ensuring that lamps were functional, all without allowing occupancy to disrupt the household's rhythm. In doing so, they reinforced the notion of readiness while preserving the secrecy of its emptiness. A tray left momentarily in its doorway, a candle positioned for effect, even the faint scent of air, freshened with linen. All were subtle reminders that the room existed not for comfort, but for control. The spare room also functioned as a measure of discretion. It was available for guests whose arrival was inconvenient, for family members whose presence required temporary concealment, or for a child or relative sent quietly into isolation. Yet these uses were exceptional and rarely prolonged. The room's primary purpose was symbolic, an architecture of reassurance that concealed as much as it suggested. Even in the house's rhythms, the spare room exerted influence. Its emptiness dictated movement in adjacent corridors. Servants passing by avoided disturbance. Family members learned the room's position and treated it with reverence, understanding instinctively that it was a space meant to remain untouched unless necessity demanded. In this way, the room shaped behavior without a word spoken. At night, the spare room acquired a peculiar presence. Shadows deepened its corners, soft gaslight cast the bed into ghostly shape, and silence seemed heavier than in occupied chambers. The house preserved the room's readiness while maintaining the illusion of activity elsewhere. Any unusual movement, an accidental creak, a sudden gust through a narrow window felt amplified, as though the room itself were aware of disruption. Its emptiness became a sentinel, a witness to the household's adherence to propriety. Modern visitors rarely appreciate the significance of such a room. They see it as decorative, functional, or an unused curiosity. They do not sense its role in the mansion's network of control, how its stillness reinforced hierarchy, how its presence disciplined movement, how it preserved the illusion of constant readiness. Yet to those who lived within, the spare room was a quiet authority. It reminded everyone that even absence could serve purpose. The spare room that was never used demonstrates the mansion's subtle mastery of perception. It enforces restraint, preserves appearances, and carries silent testimony to the household's priorities. Though its bed remains unoccupied and its surfaces untouched, the room itself records the order it maintains. In a Victorian mansion, even emptiness has weight, and the unused space is as deliberate as any chamber filled with life. Above the polished floors and orderly corridors of a Victorian mansion lay the attic, a space rarely visited, deliberately neglected, yet essential to the household's function. It was a room for storage, yes, but more than that, it was a repository for what could not be displayed, acknowledged, or confronted. Objects, memories, and moments too complicated for public scrutiny were carried upward, deposited carefully, and left to accumulate in silence. Attics were never designed for comfort. Beams were low and angular, floors uneven, light scarce, and drafts persistent. The space was utilitarian, its only decoration the shadows cast by rafter and joist. Yet within these constraints lay the mansion's genius. The attic allowed a household to segregate the inconvenient from the visible, to preserve appearances without addressing consequence. What could not exist in drawing rooms, parlors, or even bedrooms was stored overhead, contained without effort, and allowed to fade into obscurity. Servants were intimately familiar with these upper chambers. They carried items discreetly, climbing narrow stairs with careful footing, balancing parcels, crates, and parcels of linen, all while avoiding unnecessary noise. Every footstep was measured, every item placed carefully. The attic was a liminal space where discretion was absolute. No one questioned the objects stored there. To notice them was already to transgress the rules of invisibility. The house facilitated this arrangement, ensuring that every stair creaked just enough to signal presence to those in the know, while remaining unnoticed by those who must never see. The attic absorbed more than objects. It collected traces of human emotion, fleeting or inconvenient. Letters burned hastily before morning sometimes left charred fragments tucked among floorboards. Toys discarded when a child outgrew them, belongings of a guest sent away quietly, and even garments stained by illness or sorrow, all were carried upward. In doing so, the mansion preserved decorum below while quietly acknowledging life's imperfections above. The attic remembered, even when no human eye would ever register what it held. Families relied on these upper chambers to manage shame, loss, and secrecy. A room quarried of memory allowed disputes to be suspended, mistakes to be hidden, and grief to accumulate without visible disruption. If a scandal arose, a piece of furniture, a garment, or a document could be sent above, removed from sight, but not entirely erased. The attic became a silent arbiter, balancing the need for concealment against the household's ongoing performance of propriety. Children noticed it instinctively. Even without fully understanding, they learned that the uppermost floors were off-limits, that access required permission, and that what lived there was both important and forbidden. They sensed the weight of absence and the significance of containment, lessons absorbed as early as they could walk along corridors. The attic shaped their understanding of limits, discretion, and the consequences of visibility. At night, attics seemed almost animate. Shadows pooled in corners, the faint aroma of dust and old wood filled the air, and the silence was heavier than in any other part of the house. Footsteps on the stairs echoed differently in the confined space, announcing presence to those who knew to listen, but disappearing to the untrained ear. The attic's very structure enforced invisibility, maintaining both function and secrecy. Visitors seldom appreciated these spaces. They imagined attics as storage for trivial items or as empty expanses, unaware that they were integral to the mansion's capacity to maintain order and discretion. Yet for those who lived within, the attic was indispensable, a space where consequence could be deferred, where objects could be hidden, and where memory could be preserved without acknowledgement. In a Victorian mansion, the attic was more than an architectural afterthought. It was a sanctuary for what could not exist openly, a quiet repository for imperfection, and a testament to the house's ability to contain, remember, and mediate without intervention. It was the space for what must be forgotten, yet never truly disappears. Beneath the polished floors, elegant staircases, and gaslit corridors of a Victorian mansion lay the basement, a place deliberately removed from the gaze of polite society. It was not merely a functional space for storage or utility. It was the foundation upon which propriety itself depended. Here, beneath the veneer of order and civility, labor, discretion, and control converged. The basement preserved what the household could not show, sustaining the mansion above while remaining unseen. The basement was purposefully designed to be uninviting. Low ceilings pressed close to the head, floors were often uneven or cold, and light was minimal, coming from small, high windows or single flickering lamps. Its architecture dictated behavior. Movement was cautious, tasks required concentration, and voices were muted, both by design and by the house's weighty silence. To occupy the basement was to enter a realm where effort was visible only to those who understood it, and never to the society that observed the upper floors. Servants knew its passages intimately. The basement contained kitchens, pantries, coal stores, and wine cellars, all arranged for efficiency rather than display. Steep staircases and narrow corridors guided movement precisely, ensuring that labor proceeded without interruption, yet out of sight. Every task, polishing silver, preparing meals, tending boilers, was executed in measured steps. The house itself facilitated this invisibility, absorbing sound and shadow to maintain the impression that order above was effortless. Labor in the basement was constant, unglamorous, and largely unrecorded. Servants carried heavy loads, adjusted fires, cleaned endlessly, and repaired what required attention, all without acknowledgement. Their knowledge of the household's secrets grew naturally from proximity. Overheard conversations, glimpses of letters, or unnoticed gestures. The basement became both stage and sanctuary for the staff, where the machinery of the mansion was maintained while remaining invisible to its beneficiaries. Even family members interacted with the basement cautiously. Visits were purposeful, retrieving a stored item, descending for warmth, or attending to illness, but never prolonged. The space reminded them of hierarchy and propriety. It was theirs to command indirectly, not inhabit fully. It enforced a dual lesson, that work was necessary and that visibility carried consequences. The house's architecture ensured that every descent into these lower realms reinforced both restraint and understanding. At night, the basement took on an intensified presence. Shadows pooled in corners, distant dripping water echoed through stone and brick, and the faint heat of a dying coal fire seemed to pulse with hidden energy. Movement was deliberate and precise. Every step announced control. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, allowing the human activity below to continue without intrusion into the spaces above. This separation reinforced the mansion's hierarchy and preserved the illusion of effortlessness in the upper chambers. Basements also held objects too mundane, inconvenient, or improper for the polished floors above. Crates of letters awaiting destruction, discarded garments, evidence of illness or accident, and other remnants of life the household preferred to contain. The air carried faint traces of these presences, perceptible only to those attuned to its rhythm. Here, memory and material intersected. The basement preserved what must not be seen. To modern visitors, basements appear merely practical, functional, or even eerie. Few understand their essential role in sustaining the household's illusion. Yet in a Victorian mansion, the basement was vital. It centralized labor, concealed truth, and enforced discretion. Without it, the elegance above could not persist. It absorbed imperfection and transgression, maintaining appearances while recording activity silently. The basement, in all its darkness, remains a testament to the house's ability to contain, mediate, and preserve. It is the foundation of respectability, the unseen stage upon which the mansion's performance depended. Here, below the threshold of social observation, the architecture of control was absolute, and the house remembered everything that occurred in its hidden depths. Some rooms in a Victorian mansion were never meant for solitary occupancy. They existed as arenas of observation, negotiation, and concealed purpose. To enter alone was not only unusual, it was unthinkable. These rooms were structured to ensure that presence was witnessed, supervised, or shared in a manner that reinforced hierarchy and propriety. They carried the weight of social expectation as surely as their walls carried the house. These rooms were seldom central in appearance. A guest might pass by a doorway without noticing it. The architecture discouraged casual entry. Thresholds were slightly narrow, steps were deliberate, or corridors approached at an angle that required attention. Yet, once entered, the space made its requirements clear. One could not remain unnoticed. The room's proportions, furniture, and lighting ensured that the occupant's presence was always contextualized, observed by shadows, mirrors, or the anticipated approach of a companion. Servants were the first to understand these rules. They moved with precision, accompanying the occupant to ensure that proper conduct was maintained. A tray might be delivered, a candle adjusted, a letter brought or removed. Their presence was integral, yet carefully regulated. The room itself depended upon them as much as it did upon the etiquette of those it contained. Their movements ensured that nothing occurred unobserved, preserving appearances without intervention. Family members and visitors alike were aware of the implicit expectation. To enter alone was to risk impropriety, real or imagined. Meetings, consultations, or even leisure within these rooms required accompaniment. The house itself mediated the interaction. Walls absorbed sound selectively, shadows shaped perception, and furniture directed posture. The architecture dictated behavior as subtly as any social rule, ensuring that presence aligned with propriety. These rooms served multiple functions. They could accommodate confidential discussions, delicate negotiations, or discreet interventions. Illness, emotional distress, or scandal might be managed here, always under the implicit supervision afforded by architecture and staffing. Even affection or desire was carefully mediated, constrained by expectation and spatial arrangement. The house ensured that actions could occur, yet always within the boundaries of control. Over time, these spaces became repositories of subtle knowledge. Observers, servants, family members, or occasional visitors learned to interpret gesture, glance, and pause. They understood who occupied the room, why, and with what implicit sanction. Every movement, every hesitation, every measured word contributed to the mansion's silent record. The room stored these traces as part of its atmosphere, embedding experience into walls, floors, and ceilings. Night intensified the room's power. Gaslight or candlelight cast uneven illumination, emphasizing movement while obscuring detail. Shadows pooled in corners, guiding attention while softening scrutiny. Doors closed softly, ensuring that exits were noted yet discreet. Even in darkness, the room maintained the expectation of accompaniment. To occupy it was to enter a space where agency was measured, and presence was always shared, whether physically or through the unspoken influence of the house itself. Modern observers rarely appreciate these nuances. They see only the room's dimensions, its furniture, its decoration. They do not perceive the subtle mechanisms of supervision, the deliberate orchestration of social behavior, or the mansion's ability to mediate interaction without explicit instruction. Yet the house remembers. It retains the memory of every presence, every accompaniment, and every act conducted within its walls. The room no one entered alone is a testament to the mansion's mastery of control. It demonstrates how architecture, staffing, and social expectation combine to regulate behavior, preserve decorum, and contain truth. Within its walls, visibility and supervision were inseparable, and long after the occupants departed, the house continued to recall the lessons imparted there, silent but vigilant, a witness to the deliberate choreography of propriety. In a Victorian mansion, scandal rarely erupted publicly. It did not announce itself with confrontation or spectacle. Instead, it was contained, managed through architecture, ritual, and silence. The house itself participated in this containment, providing spaces for discretion, passages for concealment, and thresholds that regulated both observation and knowledge. Scandal was never solved. It was absorbed, sequestered, and rendered invisible. The process began with spatial management. Rooms were allocated according to need rather than comfort. Bedrooms, studies, and hidden chambers became temporary refuges for those whose actions or circumstances might disrupt the carefully maintained illusion of propriety. The house guided these occupants quietly, its corridors and staircases ensuring that movement occurred without exposure. Doors closed with precision, and locks, keys, and hidden panels reinforced the permanence of discretion. Servants played a crucial role in this containment. They observed without comment, intervened without recognition, and carried messages, objects, or instructions through concealed passages. Their labor was invisible yet essential. A tray delivered to a hidden chamber, a lamp adjusted to soften the room, a note placed for the occupant all ensured that the scandal could exist without reaching the eyes or ears of those unprepared to witness it. In this way, service and secrecy became inseparable. Family members learned to navigate these disruptions carefully. Conversations were measured, gestures controlled, and movement orchestrated to maintain appearances. Even subtle shifts in posture, glance, or tone could betray concern or acknowledgement, so the mansion's design mitigated exposure. Narrow corridors, angled doorways, and hidden alcoves facilitated the movement of those involved in or aware of the incident, allowing them to avoid observation while still participating in the household's ongoing life. Objects themselves contributed to containment. Letters, documents, and personal effects were relocated to attics, basements, or locked wings. Their presence was acknowledged only by those who needed to know. Items could be destroyed, hidden, or repurposed without attracting attention, ensuring that evidence of impropriety remained inaccessible to guests and casual observers. In this way, physical space reinforced social and moral boundaries. Scandal was also temporal. The mansion's routines created intervals of concealment that allowed emotion and circumstance to stabilize. Illness could be managed quietly. Disagreements could cool behind closed doors. Transgressions could be assessed and mitigated before visibility demanded resolution. The house absorbed tension, preserving the outward performance of calm while the interiors accommodated conflict, desire, or error. Night amplified this function. Gaslight dimmed, shadows lengthened, and movement slowed. The house's hidden arteries, passages, staircases, and corridors enabled activity to continue without disrupting appearances. Servants carried out their duties with heightened awareness, while family members retreated to private chambers or silent alcoves. Even minor gestures, a door left ajar, a chair shifted, A lamp positioned slightly differently served as cues within the mansion's careful orchestration. Visitors seldom detected the presence of scandal. The mansion's order, composure, and routine persisted, and to outsiders, everything seemed seamless. Yet within the house, every adjustment, every hidden movement, every quiet intervention preserved the equilibrium of appearances. The mansion remembered the incident, embedding it in shadows, floorboards, and walls, even as those involved moved forward with their lives. Scandal in a Victorian mansion was never solved. It was contained. It was absorbed into the structure of the house, managed through spatial intelligence, labor, and discretion. The mansion did not judge, nor did it condemn. It simply preserved, remembered, and maintained the performance of propriety while the human lives within adjusted to its invisible rules. In the end, the house itself became the final arbiter. It held the scandal as carefully as it held its occupants, ensuring that no evidence disrupted the illusion of order. And long after the individuals involved departed, the mansion retained memory, shaping future behavior, guiding movement, and preserving the appearance of perfection that defined Victorian life. In a Victorian mansion, inheritance was never simply a matter of property. It was a complex choreography of presence, absence, and memory. Wealth, possessions, and status were transmitted through carefully constructed rituals, while the lives and contributions of those who labored to maintain the household were often erased. The mansion itself mediated this process, preserving appearances and dictating the terms of legacy long before legal documents were signed. The architecture reinforced hierarchy in inheritance. Rooms, wings, and passages were aligned according to anticipated succession. Bedrooms, studies, and even corridors bore silent testimony to who was entitled to occupy them, who might be permitted access, and who would be relegated to invisibility. Doors opened selectively, windows framed particular views, and staircases guided movement toward authority. The mansion itself became a map of entitlement, shaping expectation even before wills were considered. Servants were both witnesses and enforcers of this order. They observed which family members entered particular rooms, which furniture they used, and which doors they crossed with confidence or hesitation. They learned which actions were sanctioned, which gestures implied future favor, and which behaviors threatened exclusion. In doing so, they preserved the rhythm of the household while reinforcing the house's subtle lessons about power and hierarchy. Yet inheritance was never only material. The house recorded influence, presence, and knowledge alongside possessions. A favored corridor, a corner of a study, or even a well-used chair might serve as evidence of long-standing authority or intimacy with the household. Conversely, rooms left unused, passages avoided, and spaces where one's presence was curtailed became markers of marginalization. The mansion embedded memory in its structure, enforcing the invisible hierarchy of value and attention. Erasure accompanied inheritance as naturally as succession itself. Family members who were overlooked, servants whose labor was invisible, and children whose lives were confined to hidden nurseries or locked wings often left no trace beyond the architecture itself. Their contributions essential to the functioning of the mansion were absorbed into the walls, floors, and ceilings, remembered by the house but omitted from recognition. The mansion, patient and impartial, held both the powerful and the overlooked in quiet equilibrium. Letters, ledgers, and documents were managed in tandem with spatial authority. Legal papers could be stored in locked wings, their existence known only to a select few. Correspondence detailing grievances, claims, or decisions that contradicted appearances was often destroyed or concealed, ensuring that public perception remained undisturbed. The mansion's architecture supported this process, creating paths for delivery and removal that avoided observation while maintaining operational efficiency. Night amplified both inheritance and erasure. Gaslight softened details, corridors swallowed footsteps, and shadows cloaked the negotiation of presence. decisions regarding succession, privilege, or exclusion were often executed quietly, leaving no immediate evidence. The mansion absorbed the outcomes, embedding them in the rhythm of daily life, in the alignment of rooms, and in the impressions of floors, carpets, and furniture. To modernize, the mansion's inheritance appears orderly, wealth distributed according to law, possessions aligned with lineage, and rooms assigned according to tradition. Yet beneath this surface, the house preserves a subtler truth, that legacy is inseparable from erasure, that authority is encoded spatially, and that memory is as much a matter of architecture as of law. In a Victorian mansion, inheritance and erasure were two sides of the same coin. The house maintained appearances while recording absence, preserving status while embedding silence, and ensuring that what was transmitted, wealth, authority, and privilege, was inseparable from what was quietly erased. It was a process both deliberate and invisible, carried out with the patience and impartiality of stone and shadow. When a Victorian family departed, the mansion did not simply await its next occupants. It remained attentive, patient, and observant, carrying the memory of lives, routines, and secrets long after the last footsteps faded. The house absorbed absence as thoroughly as it had managed presence, preserving the residue of propriety, hierarchy, and discretion in its walls, floors, and corridors. The first moments of emptiness were deceptively calm. Rooms stood as if frozen in expectation, curtains drawn neatly, furniture aligned with precision, lamps positioned as though awaiting attention. The drawing rooms and parlors retained the appearance of use, the polish of recent labor, the faint scent of waxed surfaces. Every element suggested continuity, as though the family had merely stepped out for a brief engagement rather than vacated permanently. Yet the mansion's memory extended beyond surface appearances. Bedrooms whispered of intimacy carefully maintained, children's quarters hinted at play and discipline. Hidden passageways, servant staircases, and locked wings carried traces of movement, conversation, and oversight. The house recorded absence as vigilantly as presence, retaining the imprint of gestures, schedules, and patterns that had once shaped daily life. Servants' influence lingered here as well. Even when the household departed, the infrastructure of labor remained evident. Polished floors, perfectly stoked fires, meals delivered to table and withdrawn again, rooms prepared for occupancy. These remnants maintained the illusion that the house remained active, obedient to the rhythm of a family no longer present. The mansion, in essence, continued its performance on behalf of absent occupants. Objects became traces of identity, letters left on desks, clothing folded carefully in wardrobes, toys positioned along nursery floors, all recorded the behaviors, preferences, and routines of those who had moved on. These objects were simultaneously evidence and absence, marking what had been while confirming what was no longer. The house preserved these details with impartial precision, maintaining memory even without observation. The architecture itself enforced reflection. Corridors guided footsteps in familiar rhythms, staircases channeled movement as before, and doorways framed perspectives that echoed prior occupancy. Windows, unshaded or partially drawn, allowed light to fall on furniture and floors exactly as it had when the family resided within. The mansion's design ensured that the impression of activity endured, that the structure remained coherent, and that the past lingered in tangible, almost audible ways. Night emphasized these echoes. Gaslight flickered, shadows deepened, and silence became almost palpable. Footsteps echoed differently in the absence of living bodies. The mansion seemed to breathe in anticipation of presence that would not return. The rooms, passages, and hidden chambers preserved the tension of human occupancy, translating absence into memory. Every locked door, every unused corridor, every hidden staircase retained its significance. Visitors or subsequent occupants might notice only the surface, the order, the polish, the elegance, but the house remembered far more. It retained patterns of control, hierarchy, affection, and secrecy. It preserved the structure of daily life, including the invisible threads of labor, discretion, and propriety that had once bound the household together. The house after the family left was neither idle nor neutral. It continued its role as guardian, witness, and arbiter. Absence did not diminish its function. It sharpened it. The mansion maintained memory without intervention, presence without occupancy, and authority without living hands. It was a vessel of continuity, preserving the delicate balance between what had been, what was expected, and what remained unspoken. In this way, Victorian mansions outlasted those who dwelled within them. They remembered every trace, every pattern, every moment of discretion and control. Even in emptiness, they continued their patient, deliberate work, holding the past intact while waiting for the future, a silent repository of lives, secrets, and propriety. Visitors arriving at a Victorian mansion were often struck by its grandeur, its symmetry, and its seemingly effortless elegance. Estate agents emphasized these features, highlighting polished floors, high ceilings, chandeliers, and formal gardens. What they never mentioned, and what few outsiders perceived, was the intricate machinery of concealment, discretion, and surveillance built into every corner of the house. The mansion's true character lay not in what could be admired, but in what had been carefully hidden from view. The exterior presented balance and order, windows aligned perfectly, doors opened with satisfying symmetry, and the façade suggested permanence and propriety. A casual observer assumed that interior life matched this exterior, that every family member was content, every guest welcomed, every servant accounted for. Yet the house contained layers of unseen structures, hidden staircases, locked wings, and corridors designed to channel movement and behavior, none of which were disclosed to prospective occupants or visitors. Estate agents rarely spoke of the hidden staircases that allowed servants to move unseen, or the narrow corridors that guided labor without notice. They omitted mention of rooms without windows, attics holding secrets, basements absorbing labor, and locked chambers where propriety was enforced. Even the most attentive buyer might overlook these subtleties, unaware that the mansion's very function depended on these invisible systems. The house, patient and silent, revealed its true nature only to those who lived within it. The mansion's furniture, too, was carefully arranged to manage behavior rather than comfort alone. Chairs were placed to guide posture and interaction. Tables were positioned to direct conversation and movement. Mirrors reflected only what was intended for observation. Estate agents praised the craftsmanship without acknowledging its role in controlling both human activity and perception. Every arrangement contributed to the household's equilibrium, teaching occupants to conform to the house's expectations even without spoken instruction. Even the smallest details were designed with discretion in mind. Doors that seemed ordinary might conceal passageways, rooms that appeared standard could be locked or hidden, and lamps and gas lights were positioned to shape sightlines and shadows. Estate agents emphasized visibility and accessibility, while omitting these subtleties entirely. The mansion's true logic was deliberately obscured from public view, preserved for those trained to navigate it. Visitors unaware of these hidden elements often assumed the house was straightforward, that life within it unfolded without complication. They did not perceive the hidden nursery, where children's play was monitored, the attic, where inconvenient truths accumulated, or the spare room, never used but always maintained as a symbol of preparedness. Even the most attentive occupant might not immediately recognize the influence of these concealed spaces on daily life. The mansion's power lay precisely in what was not spoken. Silence, shadows, and concealment were as essential as walls and ceilings. The house guided movement, enforced discretion, and absorbed error, all while presenting an image of effortless perfection. Estate agents, concerned only with saleability, never conveyed this complexity. They did not describe the patient vigilance of the building, the deliberate choreography of labor and discretion, or the subtle lessons imparted by hidden architecture. To live in such a house was to understand what outsiders could never see. Every corridor, room, and hidden passage reinforced hierarchy, propriety, and secrecy. Estate agents might sell the mansion for its elegance, its grandeur, or its location, but they never revealed that its true mastery was invisible, embedded in walls, floors, and ceilings, and in the careful orchestration of lives contained within. In the end, the mansion's secret was its enduring lesson. Appearances can be maintained, propriety enforced, and history preserved not through signage or explanation, but through silence, architecture, and deliberate omission. And what the estate agents never mentioned was the most important feature of all. Every Victorian mansion reaches a moment when life departs, and the house itself falls silent. It is not an abrupt stillness, but a gradual one. Footsteps slow, voices cease, lamps burn lower, and finally, the rhythm of human occupancy becomes an echo of memory. The mansion, patient and deliberate, does not collapse into emptiness. Instead, it assumes a different vigilance, preserving the accumulated presence of decades in its walls, floors, and shadows. In the final hours of occupancy, the house feels suspended. Curtains hang unchanged, furniture retains the positions long rehearsed, and the air is heavy with the accumulated sense of wax, wood polish, and human presence. Every corridor, staircase, and hidden passage retains its function, though unused. Every door, lock, and key preserves its authority. The mansion remembers all the movements, gestures, and secrets it has absorbed, cataloguing them silently as it awaits the absence that is now total. Servants, who once moved with precision and discretion, are no longer present, yet the traces of their labor remain, the floors polished to a shine that reflects memory, the hearths carefully arranged, the hidden passageways still capable of guiding movement even in disuse. The house retains their knowledge as if it were built into its timber, stone, and plaster. Every creaking floorboard, every aligned chair, every polished knob echoing their presence in a language no outsider can read. Family rooms, once vibrant with ritual and performance, fall into quietude. Drawing rooms that once hosted laughter now hold only the memory of sound. Dining halls that orchestrated manners and appearances remain intact, the polished surfaces reflecting the absence of feet and voices that once defined them. Even bedrooms, the most intimate of spaces, preserve traces of tension, affection, and restraint. The house does not forget. It simply ceases to participate actively, transitioning into a state of witness rather than enforcement. Hidden spaces, the nursery, the spare rooms, attics, basements, and locked wings retain their silent authority. Objects that once carried meaning continue to bear it. Letters that were burned or stored, toys left carefully in place, garments folded and hidden. The mansion archives these remnants with impartial fidelity. What was once carefully contained, managed, and observed remains embedded in the very structure of the house. It is a memory preserved without human intervention. Night amplifies this effect. Shadows gather in corners as if to consolidate the knowledge the house has retained. The absence of footsteps, the cessation of conversation, and the stillness of air that was once in constant motion produce a new rhythm, a rhythm of quiet observation. The mansion's vigilance persists, not in movement or correction, but in the fidelity of its memory. The way light falls on familiar furniture, and the way corridors, stairs, and passages maintain their intended order even without daily use. To outsiders, a silent Victorian mansion appears merely empty. Visitors note its grandeur, its symmetry, its preserved elegance. They do not perceive the layers of memory embedded in walls and floors, the echoes of labor, discretion, and propriety that remain intact, or the silent accumulation of secrets preserved for generations. The house's function continues in absence. It guards, records, and maintains, even without occupants. When the mansion finally falls silent, it demonstrates its ultimate mastery. It teaches that life can be orchestrated, propriety enforced, and memory preserved not through the eyes of the living, but through architecture, design, and deliberate structure. The house becomes its own witness, holding every step, every whisper, every gesture, and every secret, awaiting the next chapter of occupancy while preserving the entirety of its past. Silence in this mansion is not emptiness. It is presence without interruption, memory without action, authority without enforcement. The house, patient and absolute, endures, a custodian of propriety, discretion, and the invisible lives that shaped it, long after the last human footstep fades into stillness.